Okay.
I had call the meeting to order.
Thank you. Okay, so obviously Assembly First Nations through.
All right, I would first of all, this is our second meeting, and pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, pre-budget consultations for the budget in 2016. I would first welcome all the witnesses here this morning, and definitely want to thank you for putting your submission together quickly. I know we're under a very, very tight time frame. And that has made it difficult for people to get their pre-budget submissions together, I'm sure, but we thank you for that, and we have a very intensive week of hearings with somewhere between 84 and 90 witnesses. I would mention to the committee in the beginning, I've talked to people who are on the steering committee about it, that we had expected the minister to be here this Thursday. He can't attend, and he will make his presentation along with the Department of Finance on next Tuesday. And with that, that will open up about 6 to 8 more witnesses that we can handle in the minister's slot on this Thursday. So we'll be meeting later at 8 o'clock tonight as a steering committee to make those decisions. So with that, I'll turn to the first witnesses, the Assembly of First Nations, Peter Dinsdale and Dale LeClaire. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the honour song by the member. It is truly enlightening to see this in a committee. For those of you that may not be aware, the role and function of the AFN is to serve as a national delegate forum for determining and harmonizing the effective, collective, and cooperative measures on any subject matter that the First Nation delegate for review, study, response, or action, and for advancing the aspirations of First Nations. Our 2016 budget submission focuses on the demonstrable need for additional funding to close the gap between First Nations and the rest of Canada. This includes funding for education, health, housing, water, capital infrastructure, child and family, environmental, stewardship, economic development, social development, and the removal of the 2% cap. AFN continues to emphasize that in addition to significant investments to create equitable funding, a fundamental transformation of relationship between First Nations and Canada is required in order to achieve significant change for First Nations. Prime Minister Trudeau has committed to, quote, immediately lifting the 2% cap on funding for First Nations programs and working to establish a fiscal relationship that gives First Nations communities sufficient, predictable, and sustainable funding. Over to Mr. Dinsdale.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Dinsdale. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Assembly of First Nations, and Dale LeClaire is the Chief of Staff. So certainly honored to be here to present to the committee. I'd like to thank the member for the honour song and acknowledge that we're on the unceded Algonquin territories, and pleased to be here to present. As Mr. LeClaire noted, that there are a number of spending priorities that have been articulated over the past while, certainly during the campaign, and we've endeavoured as the Assembly of First Nations to pull together a submission which we just handed out here this morning, which outlines some of those funding commitments and priorities that were stated during the campaign. Mr. LeClaire already mentioned the need for the removal of the 2% cap. We would also acknowledge that in the federal election there was also a commitment to create new funding mechanisms to make sure that First Nations are funded appropriately as levels of government. As you may be aware, currently they're funded through contribution agreement type processes, through existing Treasury Board formats and models, which of course is problematic in operation of government institutions. We've also highlighted in our submission other areas of funding commitments that have been made. First Nations education, of course, comes to the forefront, understanding the need for First Nations control of First Nations education, understanding during the campaign there's various commitments in the platform and costed out in terms of what it would take. We have commentary around that. Certainly, the child protection, child welfare issue is really pressing upon us, given the recent Canadian Human Rights Tribunal findings of discrimination of funding on non-reserved child welfare. There needs to be some remedies, and the budget, of course, being a natural opportunity to do that. We've taken a moment to highlight the need for Indigenous languages to be appropriately resourced. Across the country, very few Indigenous languages are expected to survive, so the kind of honor song you heard this morning would not be sung in generations because people will no longer be able to speak that language. Skills and training investments are critical. There's a number of programs that are up for renewal and lapsing, and frankly, over the past fiscal year have not been funded or increased whatsoever. We're looking at those as well to be addressed. Areas of justice around family violence prevention, First Nations policing, and Aboriginal justice strategies, of course, are highlighted. Each of them have various programs that are in sunsetting and various opportunities, frankly, to increase and have better programming available. A very important and critical issue is infrastructure with all Canadians and with First Nations. With First Nations, we're not talking about public transportation lines and P3s and green energy programs. We're talking about clean drinking water in communities. We're talking about basic housing. We're talking about the basic infrastructure it requires in communities just to function in what we'd expect across Canada. So while we appreciate there's been significant commitments made, there needs to be a specific First Nation component. P3 projects won't work because we don't have the fiscal arrangements in order to have the matching contributions, things of that nature, and the types of investments that are required are quite different. The Prime Minister committed to eliminate clean drinking waters within 5 years. This budget is a perfect opportunity to launch that and get to work on it immediately. There are other areas, for the interest of time, that are in our submission. There's full summary tables as well. I'll be happy to answer any questions. We promise, because there's two of us, we'd only take 5 minutes, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I would mention as well that you did give us a presentation that will be translated and just so you know, and given to all committee members. Turning then to the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, John Williamson, who's Vice President Research, who knows this place well.
Mr. Chairman, members of the House of Commons Finance Committee, I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies to offer our viewpoint to you. There are, of course, many challenges facing the new government, and indeed the government will want to act on them. We all understand that the government's spending power is considerable, but ultimately comes from its ability to tax and accumulate debt. If the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies can leave members with one overriding objective, it is not to become hooked on chronic deficit spending that will eventually return Canada to the days of a government that is overextended. Going into debt is a lot like getting entangled in a foreign conflict, easy to get into and very difficult to get out of. We know this from Canada's experience with deficit spending in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and more recently, but less dramatically, in the last Parliament when the former government worked to balance the budget following heightened spending in the aftermath of the 2008 Great Recession. It is worrisome to hear from the current government that promised annual deficits of no more than $10 billion could see the red ink more than double this year. This would make it nearly impossible to return to balance in the near term. And once we start down this road, we know how it ends. Rising and wasteful spending on annual interest payments, higher taxes, and even eventual cuts to federal transfer payments. So here are 3 suggestions to controlling costs while still hitting policy objectives. First, plan future infrastructure spending so it achieves the maximum economic benefit. The Finance Minister is under great pressure to get money out the door quickly. Give him some room to maneuver so that money isn't poorly spent. The original Liberal promise was to spend more over a 4-year mandate, not push it all out quickly. Stick to that plan so tax dollars are wisely spent. Second, control the number of public sector workers as well as pay, benefit, and pension costs. According to the public accounts, the cost per federal employee is $124,497. While there is debate over the size of the wage gap, there is near universal agreement that public sector workers enjoy more generous benefits than those in the private sector. There are 2 ways to control the overall budget envelope: reduce the number of workers or lower the cost by using outside benchmarks when negotiating contracts. This committee would be well advised to monitor the size and cost of the public sector for the bureaucracy has the ability to quietly but quickly expand when attention is focused elsewhere. Indeed, our work at AIMS reveals that the size and cost of my region's public sector is larger and costlier than that in other parts of Canada. It is one reason for our budget deficits and why taxes back home are at punitive levels. Third, incentives matter. As the old proverb goes, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Provinces are very much like the proverbial man. Simply providing additional federal transfers for social programs to low-growth provinces ultimately does a disservice to these regions. The fiscal gap these provinces experience is due in part to a dwindling workforce and a departure of young workers to other provinces. This results in these provinces having more seniors as a percentage of the overall population, which of course reduces the tax base and drives up the per capita health costs. Equalization is the complex tool to ensure that so-called have-not provinces have similar fiscal capacity. Meanwhile, federal transfers to all provinces and territories for health, education, and social services should remain uniform. That is calculated on a per capita basis across the country. This is the way to incentivize provinces to adopt pro-growth policies that create jobs to keep and attract young workers. Offering additional transfer dollars due to long-standing, tough circumstances will not change the dismal economic outlook for these jurisdictions. If provincial governments are provided more transfers without a requirement to adopt growth policies and develop their resources, the economic outlook for Atlantic Canada will not improve. And after a few years, after more workers have departed and the situation has worsened, these governments will be back asking Ottawa for more. A robust economy is a result of good public policy choices. When the productive sector of the economy is healthy, it means governments have the resources to fund important social programs. Finally, I'd be remiss if I did not make the case for the Energy East pipeline. This project will create good-paying jobs across Canada and in the Maritimes. Along with the other large projects in the region, such as the shipbuilding in Halifax and the Lower Churchill and Newfoundland Labrador, Energy East is important to growth in our region and the long-term development of Atlantic Canada. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you very much, John. The next witness, the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, Mr. Poshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and allow me, I'll put in another Atlantic vote for an Energy East. So good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, all. Thank you for inviting me today. This is my first visit to this session. I've testified often before this committee and others in their prior forums. I see familiar faces and some new ones. And to everyone, I say it is an honor to appear at the first substantive meeting of a committee that I've always held in high esteem. And to turn the tables from the perspective of witness, welcome to you and welcome all around. This is a very, very important committee in the parliamentary process. To business. I think we're all aware of the economic and fiscal backdrop, so I won't spend time on it. Instead, I'll suggest a few budget-relevant items from the new government's platform, suggest some areas where more study is needed, and add some substantive suggestions, if I may. Items that need further study include the notion of an infrastructure bank. The case for it depends on federal borrowing costs being lower than those of subsidiary governments. Yet if the federal government is to be a responsible steward, it would have to lend on terms that reflected borrowing costs plus the borrower's idiosyncratic risks. An infrastructure bank cannot make those risks disappear, and taxpayers still bear them. As to prioritizing infrastructure spending, the idea that interest rates are low, so what better time for governments to borrow to finance infrastructure spending, is simply a mirage. Potential projects must always be ranked in declining order of public and private investment, always. Infrastructure projects that improve private sector productivity, build jobs and incomes, like transport linkages, those are the projects to be preferred. Otherwise, we toss good money after bad. To give an example, the new government's mandate favors public transit, and that might be great. Public transit helps people where congestion is an issue, but it does little for the rest of us, and nothing at all for moving goods or international trade and services on which Canada depends. Exhibit A for how to get this profoundly wrong is the disaster of the Union Station to Pearson Airport rail link in Toronto. This is a predictable and predicted and unprintable financial disaster, and it could stretch into the 9 figures. Shifting back to the new government's platform, one item is the maintenance of Income Tax Act provisions for labor-sponsored venture capital corporations. And on innovation, businesses in Canada have a mixed record in turning ideas into growth. We have successes and failures. LSVCCs, the venture capital corps, have a clear record on the failure front. They have a record of value destruction and as an unproductive tax system subsidy, and alternatives should be sought. Switching to the more positive side, the personal income tax system hasn't had a serious look in 16 years, and it has grown ornaments, dubious credits and benefits, and a top-to-bottom examination of the personal tax system is well overdue. The corporate tax system last got a serious look in 97-98, and that led to useful changes. Canada's system of international tax got another look in 2008 by way of an federal advisory panel on which I had the honour to serve, and we got some good changes at the time. But there's more to do on the business and international tax front, so I'm looking for a fresh review with an eye to innovation. And there are things we can do that don't involve directly subsidizing R&D, a habit for which we have very little to show. I would rather see us use the tax system to encourage innovation, to encourage the adoption of new ideas, by way of a reduced tax rate for business income when we adopt and commercialize intellectual property. What I'm talking about is known as the innovation box or a patent box, and it taxes business income from innovation at a lower rate than otherwise. And the approach is being more common among our Western European competitors and is on the table in U.S. Congress as of this past summer. So if I were allowed just two things in this budget, one would be a thorough tax system review, including a tax expenditure review, and the other is to call for a proper evaluation. And I thank you for yours.
Thank you very much, and thank everybody for really sticking to their time. The Canadian Airport Council, and Mr. Gooch, President. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the committee and colleagues on the panel, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on two areas of urgency to Canada's airports: infrastructure funding criteria for 6 small airports on federal land, as well as sufficient resources to support CATSA screening. As an industry, airports are a key component in Canada's $35 billion air transport sector, supporting 141,000 direct jobs around the country. The CAC has 48 members with airports that range in size from global hubs like Toronto Pearson and Vancouver International to smaller community airports in places like Charlottetown and Prince George. Selon l'approche actuelle de l'utilisateur,
with our current user pay system used by transport companies, air transport companies in Canada, travelers need to cover the costs of infrastructure and airport services. This approach has served Canada well in many ways. According to the World Economic Forum, we have the best airport infrastructure in the world. Moreover, our airports have invested more than $19 billion in improving their infrastructure without seeking help from taxpayers. Ever since the federal government left the control of airports to companies, which occurred in 1992.
Here to talk to you about today support the need to update our air transport policy approach. While we look forward to working with Minister Garneau on the recommendations we anticipate in the CTA review report, we hope you will agree that there is some urgency to our work in the two areas we are outlining today. Canada's airports have confidence in the security value being provided by the team at the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, which has a tough job. But at the best of times, security screening isn't pleasant for travelers, and these haven't been the best of times. Aviation is an economic issue, and it's a sector that's growing. This growth means our airports have been experiencing ever-increasing demand. In fact, Canada's airports have seen a 24% increase in traffic over the past 5 years. With one of the highest air traveler security charges in the world, this has meant record revenue for the federal government. But the money transferred to CATSA has failed to keep pace with traffic growth. Funding has been unpredictable from year to year. As a result, we have seen wait times grow at our largest airports. At Toronto Pearson last year, for example, about 17% of passengers waited more than 15 minutes, and waits of 45 minutes were experienced at some peak hours. This is more than just a problem of passenger experience for Canadian travelers, however. It also impacts air carrier on-time departures, and it impacts our competitive positioning in the world for valuable transit passengers who don't need to travel through Canada and will not if the experience is unpredictable or unpleasant. Any solution to the problem has to start with the establishment of service level standards. Under the standard jointly proposed by the airports, Air Canada and WestJet, nearly all passengers would be screened in 10 minutes or less, and no passenger would wait more than 20 minutes. This approach will require a commitment to fund to the standard, and it will require some time to work through the machinations of government. This is why our request at this hour is specific. Provide CATSA with the additional funding it needs to provide a competitive level service at screening for the next fiscal year. To compete globally, we need to ensure screening at Canada's airports is provided at a level of service better than current levels. I hope you will agree that travelers should be receiving value for money in the government services that they pay for. When it comes to the passenger experience at screening, we cannot say today that they are. Growth continues. Toronto and Vancouver alone anticipate 3.8 million additional passengers this year. That's equivalent to an airport about the size of Halifax or Winnipeg added to the system this year. On the infrastructure side, it was a central tenet of the National Airports policy that NAS airports on federal land be self-sufficient for operating and capital costs. As a system, this has been the case and will continue to be the case even if federal infrastructure programs are to be opened up as we suggest. While airports around the country have invested $19 billion in infrastructure improvements without taxpayer support, they've also contributed more than $4.6 billion back to the government in airport rent since 1992. This far exceeds the $38 million a year in capital assistance that goes back to other small airports and a handful of other one-time investments made by past governments under regional development funds. I hope you will agree that this has been a good value for taxpayers. But even back when the National Airports Policy was being written, it was understood that NAS airports with particularly low traffic volumes would find it challenging to cover both operating and capital costs. Nevertheless, language barring airports on federal land has been inserted into eligibility criteria for federal funding programs, most notably Building Canada and the Airports Capital Assistance Program. This criteria has seen federal money go to some airports with higher traffic volumes, while the airports at Charlottetown, Fredericton, Gander, London, Prince George, and St. John have been barred from even applying to the same programs. These airports, I may add, either pay rent to the federal government today or start paying rent this year. In fact, all but one of the airports will start paying rent this year. The other one already does. Le secteur du transport aérien, incluant les aéroports, est préoccupé.
The air transport sector, including airports, is concerned by the increase in operating costs and the industry's competitiveness. But there are not many options for funding airport infrastructure under the current policy. That's why we were very happy to see that the Liberal Party supported the airport's needs during the last elections. With your support, we hope to see the necessary changes in 2016.
Il me fera plaisir de répondre à toute question que vous pourriez avoir. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gooch. I'm well aware of the complaints from small airports. I live near one. Ms. McEwen with the Canadian Labour Congress, Senior Economist, Social and Economic Policy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm here on behalf of the Canadian Labour Congress, which is the national voice of 3.3 million unionized workers in Canada. Our affiliate unions members work in virtually all sectors of the Canadian economy, in all occupations, and in all parts of Canada. As you know, in the near term, the macroeconomic picture for Canada appears bleak. But fortunately, Canada has a comparatively strong fiscal position and has ample fiscal room to undertake significant long-term investments in public, physical, and social infrastructure. The federal government has an historic opportunity to make targeted and strategic investments in infrastructure that will lift long-term productivity growth while also repairing a portion of our badly frayed social safety net that Canadians rely on. We have provided the clerk with a longer brief outlining some of our priorities for building a fairer and more prosperous Canada, but given the time constraints, I'm going to focus my comments on infrastructure, training, and employment insurance. So the Canadian Labour Congress absolutely supports the federal government's plans to invest in physical and social infrastructure. In the short term, infrastructure spending, housing investments, and transfers to low-income households carry the highest stimulus multipliers with relatively small leakages to savings or to imports. We recommend that all infrastructure spending should consider the necessity of a transition to a green economy. There is enormous potential here to create good jobs and build for the future. In fact, the labour movement in Canada has developed a plan which would create 1 million climate jobs over 5 years, and that would put us on track to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 1/3 in a decade. This plan includes just transition commitments and labour adjustment mechanisms. The three priority infrastructure areas that we've identified in this plan are energy efficiency, public transit, and renewable energy. These investments will help us achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals and provide good jobs for workers. In addition, we urge the federal government to invest in a green jobs skills training program to ensure that workers are equipped and available to perform energy efficiency home and building retrofits that are needed to reduce energy consumption. This is the lowest hanging fruit that we have. This is the biggest difference that we could make is in energy efficiency. And we have people that are mostly trained to do these things, but with a little bit of additional training can be rerouted from jobs, say, that they've lost in the oil sands to jobs in energy efficiency. To this end, we encourage the federal government to develop a green skills fund in advance of anticipated federal transfers for new infrastructure investments. Federal infrastructure projects are also a perfect opportunity for the federal government to work with unions and industry leaders and the Assembly of First Nations to remove barriers and create opportunities for women and other underrepresented groups in skilled trades. I want to second what was said earlier, that within infrastructure, there is a very special requirement for First Nations. Federal funding for drinking water and sanitation in Indigenous communities should be a high priority for this government. It is unacceptable that in a nation as wealthy as ours, that this critical necessity is not available to everyone. We also encourage the labor movement encourages the federal government to ensure that social infrastructure investments such as childcare and healthcare are provided publicly and implement uniform national standards. With regard to employment insurance, we urge the government to act swiftly on their commitment to eliminate the current 910-hour eligibility hurdle for new entrants and re-entrants to the labor market, and to reverse the 2012 changes that were punitive to unemployed workers. We would also like to bring to your attention that cuts to frontline services have meant long delays in accessing benefits for many unemployed workers, particularly in the West, surprisingly, and in Atlantic Canada. We urge an immediate allocation of $100 million in 2016-17 to the EI program in order to improve processing times and reduce delays in appeals and reconsideration of benefit decisions. We note that there will be an accumulated surplus in the employment insurance account in 2016 and ask that the government use this surplus to implement these promises immediately in their first budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. And from the Conference Board of Canada, Mr. Hodgson, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all members of the committee. I've been here many times. Some of you, it's the first time, so hopefully you get a chance to know each other a bit better. I'm part of the circle of economists who give advice to Minister Morneau directly. And in fact, we were meeting with the minister in Toronto on Friday. So I thought one of the things I could usefully put on the table this morning are my comments from Friday. And I've got 4 points to make. First of all, in the economic outlook, I think the consensus is that our economy is growing, but growth is, I think the best word is probably feeble. We think Alberta will be in a recession again this year. Growth is going to be very weak in both Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. But in other parts of the economy, growth is actually fairly robust. We think BC, for example, can grow around 3%, Central Canada around 2.25% to 2.5%. But overall, our forecast is for national growth of 1.7%. So the purpose of this first budget should be to give the economy a gentle nudge without necessarily building up a large stock of debt down the road. And that's my second point. I do think it's really important for a new government to establish fiscal anchors. Give the public a sense of what your strategy is going forward. I would put a lot of weight on the debt-GDP ratio falling over the next 4 years, for example, to ensure that we actually have the capacity to add more significant fiscal stimulus if we fall back into the kind of recession we saw in 2008-9. So take not just a one-year view, but a whole of term view about the debt load that the federal government can afford to carry going forward, knowing that the more interest payments you make, the less you have available for other purposes. I advise Minister Morneau to be prudent in this budget. You can be prudent either by using a fairly modest growth forecast, and the federal government forecasts nominal income growth, not the real growth in the economy, but real growth plus inflation. And I think there's a widespread agreement amongst economists that nominal income growth is going to be fairly weak. And I would frankly aim towards the lower end of the band to ensure that you have upside potential. Another way to add prudence to your budget is by increasing the reserves built into the budget. and have a sense that you can actually hit your fiscal targets and even have a bit more room to spare. So prudence is either a matter of using modest growth assumptions or building reserves into the budget, but I do think prudence is called for. And then lastly, I'm going to pick up some of the comments of my colleagues here. I think the real purpose of the budget should be to start setting out a plan for stronger growth in Canada. We're now in a period with aging demographics, where economic growth of even 2% is going to be hard to reach, and we should be examining all possible options to try and add greater growth to our economy on a going forward basis. So things like making the right investments in infrastructure, not spending on things that give you payback today, but are going to give the economy a long-term payback going out 20, 25 years. Things like rethinking the tax system. And Finn, I liked your comments a great deal. I've been writing about that for a decade or so, about how it's time to rethink the tax system to deal with the massive tax expenditures we have, which leak out about $100 billion a year in federal revenue, which we actually don't know what the interaction is amongst all the expenditures as well. And that might be a challenge for this committee. You could show leadership by taking on the task of showing leadership on rethinking the tax system. You're going to be here for at least 4 years. What a great opportunity to really add to the vitality of the Canadian economy. And I'll close, Mr. Chairman, by saying I've never tweeted from a committee before, but I had a chance to take a photo and tweet. So the committee is now being shared with my followers across the country, which is kind of a fun thing to do.
Thank you. I hope we're all smiling when that tweet went out, were we?
You certainly were, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, all the witnesses. I'll turn now to the first round of questions, which is 7 minutes. And if I could remind the witnesses first, there will be some questions in French, and so if you could have your translation device on, so we don't have to take a lot of time for that. First question from the Liberal Party, Mr. Ouellette.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Chair.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I would like to thank the witnesses for your statements this morning. My first question is for the Assembly of First Nations. I would like to know why there are so few urban reserves in Canada. We know that these economic development zones could create a lot of possibility to create capital, but we don't have a lot of economic reserves in our country. Why is that?
Thank you very much for the question. You know, that's frankly something that we're trying to have more of. There's many TLEs and additions to reserves that are outstanding, was with the last government for whatever reason weren't pushed through. So I think that is certainly something to look at, and certainly something we support.
On from the booth here, you don't.
Oh, they're going to turn it on. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just think that when I often think about urban reserves is because there's not enough of them, and I often think about the how it would often just not even be an amount of money the federal government spends, but just simply ensuring that there's a faster and more efficient process in order to create these economic development zones, these urban reserves in communities where people can actually accumulate capital, which I think is so important for First Nations people, but really anyone who really wants to participate in the modern economy.
Thank you very much, and I think you're correct. I think we have a great number of examples out there where we have urban reserves, more likely, more commonly the Lower Mainland with the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam communities. I think there's a lot of dynamics that go on with urban reserves. I think probably our greatest difficulty is having communities, regions, municipalities, and provinces agree when we start to negotiate land deals and TLEs. I think there's a great deal of resistance because there's a misunderstanding about First Nations reserves not being part of the local economy, and I think that's quite wrong. And I think the Squamish Nation certainly demonstrates that it can be a cooperative economy and a very, very lucrative and very, very informative and successful program. So,
thank you very much. And then the next question is for Mr. John Williamson from the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. I would just like to, I think you were suggesting that various regions of the country, if they're not doing well economically, that it's normal for people to move away, and then in fact this is actually beneficial for the long-term economy. But and so even that we shouldn't even be doing too many transfers to these regions that aren't doing well. But I'd just also like to actually point out to you, I was reading one of the reports from your institute. Good problem to have. Lessons for Atlantic Canada from Alberta's experience with natural resource revenue. And I actually thought it was actually a very well-written paper. It was talking about how, in fact, we should save for those times when, in the future, we might not have those resources, or the market might not be doing so well for natural resources. And I was just wondering if you know about this report, and if you could discuss it a little bit.
Well, thank you for your question. First of all, I'd like to be very clear on just a point you made. It is actually not beneficial for people to leave a region. We see that now in Atlantic Canada, where the drain of young workers is having a serious negative economic impact on the region, and as a result of that, social spending has increased and is set to increase to levels that are unsustainable because there just is not the tax base there. I'm not familiar with the report you cited in detail, except that I will say obviously there is a debate in the country over using natural resources, how best to use those resources, balancing the economic opportunities with the environmental mental costs. And these are decisions for every single province and region to make on their own under the federal framework.
Mr. Ouellette, you still have 3 minutes.
Great. My next question is for Mr. Finn Porschman. Thank you very much for your being a witness here today. I was just going to ask about manufacturing, because also you have written a report in the past on manufacturing, and I'm just going to quote, aggregate data shows that Atlantic manufacturing firms are smaller than nationally, with experts per plant about 30% lower. Atlantic plants also tend to have lower productivity measured in terms of output per hour worked, are less likely to innovate and adopt advanced technology, and are less likely to export and are otherwise be involved in global business activities. And I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the ways that we could go supporting these value-added industries that are actually going to create really good long-term paying jobs.
Oh, terrific, Mr. Chairman. A great question. Very good. Some of the measures apply everywhere. Some of them are more particularly helpful in the Atlantic region. Key is education at the primary and secondary level, which is where we lag in terms of standards, and building a foundation through education for the long haul. So then your post-secondary performance improves as well. Then you have a better trained workforce that has the skills to engage globally and to compete globally. The other issues are around scale. The cities in the Atlantic provinces tend to be small, and this is one of the reasons why population and population growth is such a key issue. So generating centers of attraction that keep, attract, retain people, especially young people, and these approaches are very, very long-term approaches, but I think they're the ones that we have to take. And one of the reasons I think about scale and attracting and retaining people, including immigrants, is that if you build up enough density with enough people, they'll figure out what to do, and they'll create their own markets and opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Porschman. Very quick one, Robert.
Okay. Well, I'd actually like to share my time just here with the Parliamentary Secretary, if that's all right with the rest of the members of the committee.
Maybe swear in. Is that okay? Yeah. Does he have consent? Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Champagne.
Bonjour, ma question pour Madame McEwen.
Is for Madam McEwen. You have talked about stimulating an open economy, stimulating the green economy. You've also talked about energy efficiency, public transportation, renewable energy. I can tell you that after having consulted Canadians across the country, this is what people are asking to do. You're also talking about household renovations could also contribute. I know England has a similar program of investing a great deal in household renovation because that was a major contribution to reducing greenhouse gases. I would like you to hear about the same practices that you have seen in Canada and around the world, and what could we use.
Cut you off there. We're going to run over time. A quick answer.
Sure. So Manitoba in particular has done some innovative things around pay as you save. So we have a report on the Green Economy Network where we outline some of what has been done, and you can take a look at that, how you can have programs to incentivize people to do this private sector stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Ms. Raitt.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I'm going to start by going back to what you said at the beginning, that the minister will not be appearing before committee this week, that we can expect him from next week. And I would just like to remind the chair that we anticipate his testimony and we look forward to it. And I do hope that he will show up next week. And I am concerned that other things will happen that'll take away his busy schedule. And I would just leave this for the committee to remember, that on this side we have Conservative members, we have NDP members, and together we represent 9.1 million Canadians. And that is an important number to remember, because it's in this committee, in this House of Commons, where the minister has accountability to those 9.1 million Canadians. And I take it very seriously, and I expect him to be here. Mr. Chair, you're a minister. I was a minister for 7 years as well. You always take the invitation of the committee. There are scheduling issues, I understand, but this is a serious matter, and I will take great offense if he does not, in fact, come here next Tuesday and speak to us. So with that, I will turn my nicer face to the witnesses and thank them for their testimony so far. You're not going to get cranky, Lisa. I have three separate sets of questions, if you'll indulge me. First of all, to the Assembly of First Nations. I'm sorry, we don't have your full report yet. It's coming in translation. But if you can give me an idea of what the total bucket or the total ask is. And I ask that question because I know that the minister has already promised many billions. And I just want to get a sense from you as to what the ask is for your total package.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there are summary budgets that are provided, and the ask that we're presenting here today is a total of 3.9, which includes all of the education commitments and the infrastructure, a portion of the infrastructure ask. So.
Thank you very much. And do you have delivery systems currently in place to be able to make sure that the money gets into the programs you talked about, the culture, the Indigenous languages, all that stuff?
Yeah, pardon me, absolutely. There's a variety of different kind of existing programs. We're talking about updating infrastructure, has, of course, oversubscribes in all the kind of areas that they're at. These aren't new programs. These are enhancements to existing programs.
Okay, that's good to know because, of course, if the money does flow from a budget, you want to make sure that it's not caught up in a bureaucratic haze, which it can. And then thirdly and finally, if you'll indulge me for this, I believe that a new term was brought to our attention this week in the term Indigenous license. And I'd like to get your perspective only from the finance point of view, meaning does the term, what is Indigenous license, and does the term have a monetary component from my perspective in terms of finance? Because obviously it's, we're talking about total packages here.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question. And it is a term that has and will continue to evolve in regard to the nation-to-nation relationship, how we engage government, and how we move through this process of whether it's in finance or whether it's in environment or natural resources, is that we firmly believe, as this government has committed, that the recognition of the inherent right of First Nations people. I think we talk about full engagement, full dialogue, full accommodation. So I think in regard to the political concept of overriding concept of Indigenous license is one of full relationship and a full dialogue. Mr. Dinsdale, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think and I'll be quick. I think I'd caution this, and you weren't saying it, but any notion that it doesn't mean that we're not pro engagement on projects such as those that have been described here. I think the important point is the Supreme Court has found that there are significant Indigenous rights that exist. People understand the notion of social license. I think this is social license with the combined impact of recognizing those title and rights that exist and finding the appropriate compromise. Just last week, we finished an energy forum that brought together members of industry, First Nations, environmental people, all to have this very conversation in terms of how do we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very helpful. For the Canadian Airports Council, you mentioned that there were 6 small airports that, of course, have difficulties in doing some things as simple as buying a snowblower. And on a day like today in Ottawa, you can understand the importance of a snowblower in some of these airports. And I understand what you're saying about targeted investment, but can you take a step back for a second and give us the pitch on why this is an important investment specifically for communities as they try to take advantage of a growing tourism market in these non-traditional destinations, because I think that's an important piece for the committee to hear, that it's not about Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. It is about places off the beaten path that would like to be able to serve a greater tourist market, which is a growing market right now, and I'm sure we'll hear from tourism people. So if you could help us with that, Mr. Gucci, I'd be appreciative.
Yes, thank you. Well, the 6 small airports that I've identified, Charlottetown, Fredericton, Prince George, they're in smaller communities and they have lower traffic volumes. These are all airports that handle fewer than 600,000 passengers a year. And even when the National Airports Policy was being written, it was recognized that airports with these lower traffic volumes would have challenging paying for infrastructure. These are the gateways to the community. You look at Prince George, located in northern British Columbia. I believe it takes about 7 or 8 hours to drive to Vancouver. We don't always think of these communities as having international business, but they do. I mean, if you go to Prince George, they have a college there that attracts students from all over the world. So these are critical components of infrastructure, but they don't have the volumes of traffic that an airport like even the Winnipegs or Halifax, not large in the grand scheme of things, but you know, in terms of the volume of traffic to get the revenue required through normal business practices to be able to cover the cost of infrastructure and their ongoing operating costs on a regular basis. Air transportation is a highly capital-intensive industry. It's an expensive industry to operate in, and in the smaller communities, the economies of scale are just not there.
Yeah.
Quick, short one.
Absolutely, and it is short. It's for the Canadian Labour Congress. I noticed that you're a senior economist, so I'm wondering, as an economist, can you define for me what you use in your analysis as the income band for middle-class label?
I, as an economist, don't use the term middle class. I find it quite meaningless. But if I were to talk about, if somebody were forcing me to talk about the middle class, I would go with probably from the 20th to the 80th percentile in terms of income.
Thank you very much. That's it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. 8. Mr. Caron.
Merci
7
beaucoup.
minutes.
Merci.
And I would like to support Madame Reid in her comments about the importance of the minister before this committee. And we're not going to talk about it's important that we can hold the minister accountable, and this is very. I would like to begin with the Assembly of First Nations. Welcome. I have a question, and I will limit myself to 3 questions, one at a time. It was mentioned there is a ceiling on expenditure under the previous government. Since the last 20 years, since until 1916, what amount should have been spent between 1996 and 2016? And in the past 20 years, what amount of money has not been spent? And if we had followed if we had increased education expenditures, what amount of money would you have had over that period between 2006 and 2016?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a bit of a technical question, and it's one that is difficult to arrive at in the time period that is affected. You'll see in our submission that we have taken a look at the funding cap that, as you've described. And here's what we've put together, and I might read it from the submission for you. It might be a little more clear. The AFN estimated that there has not been a 2% cap, and had it not been imposed in 1996. The budget would have seen today an additional $3.34 billion. And so that was the cumulative effect, or the effect as it affects today. The cumulative effect over the time period, we've calculated that to be the cumulative effect of about $25.5 billion that has not flowed to the First Nations communities because of the cap.
OK. Et ça, donc, ça tient compte, en fait, au bout du compte, c'est le montant ou
So this is the amount of the investment increase in education costs that has not been invested. You're saying that goes up to $25 billion. The fact that this, we hope that the fact that this 2% cap has been lifted is important. There's also the question of health care spending, social programs. At the present time, the provinces receive a 6% increase, and social spending approximately 3%. And education expenditure seems to be at about a 5% increase per year. What do you think that for First Nations program, according to your opinion of the issues, what type of escalator are in expenditures would you think is necessary?
Thank you for the question. I think as you indicate, each area has a different kind of proxy. Health, we have the 6% proxy. We're seeing education is closer to 4.4% vis-a-vis the provincial jurisdictions. Things like infrastructure, we have no proxy. There's no existing proxy to utilize in terms of a growth. So a lot of our growth estimates, we've taken the 4.5 rate, which seems to be an average of the social indicators growth, and we applied those to our estimates that are in our submission as well.
Okay. Dernière question, rapidement. Vous avez parlé justement de l'importance de l'eau potable.
We're talking about the importance of drinking water on the reserves. The government has committed itself to solving the problem, and so that there will no longer be boil water advisories on First Nations property. How is this going to be done? How would we start the process, and what type of investments will be required to achieve this end?
Well, I think the initial investment is going to be quite large. I think what we have, and in working with the department, I think there's a lot of identification of what needs to be done and the type of investments. There's there's a great many shovel-ready, studies that have been done, and so I think there is going to be the opportunity to do some immediate direct investment for those communities that are ready to go. There are obviously far too many boil water advisories in the country, in our First Nations communities, that need to be addressed immediately, although they will take a substantial amount more time to get at. But I think right now, if we're to look at and the request in regard to the infrastructure commitment, I think that in the first year, it would be my hope that the commitment that was made could be addressed rather, within the 12-18-month timeline as set out. So,
merci beaucoup. Je vais passer maintenant à Mme McEwen.
Thank you, Madam McEwen. You talk about employment insurance, and when we talk about employment insurance, can you hear me? We're talking about contributions, and there's a debate between Liberals and Conservatives about the amount of a contribution, particularly for the employer, and the role of employment insurance as an economic stabilizer. We can see in Alberta, Saskatchewan, also Newfoundland and Labrador, where the economic situation is not necessarily rosy. Can you tell how employment insurance plays a role as an economic stabilizer, particularly at times of economic distress?
Certainly. So I'm actually a member of an employment insurance working group that has put out a pre-budget statement, and in that statement we say we cite federal government research from HRSDC that employment insurance is the single most effective automatic stabilizer that the government has, and it reduces the impact of recessions and unemployment by about 14% in the wake of recessions. It's also money that we have there that can be got out quickly, so it's the fastest out the door. If you're worried about implementing the right infrastructure project, take your time, implement those infrastructure projects that we need to have done, and get money to people through the employment insurance program so that they can buy the things that they need in their daily lives and make ends meet until they can find another job.
De quelle manière est-ce que les modifications qui ont été apportées à l'assurance emploi et particulièrement la situation
how the changes that were made to employment insurance, and so you have to work 910 hours, and in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where people are losing jobs, and sometimes in order to survive, they will find little jobs here and there and hope that the economy will improve, and in the meantime, they do small jobs. Access to employment insurance presently in Alberta, it was about 600 or 700 hours because that is related to the rate of employment, and so you need to have small jobs to get that. And through
running
Et dernière question rapide à ce moment-là. La réforme.
Question: the reform has resulted in the fact that when people sometimes people have to take jobs that are lower paying, and what is the impact of that on economic stabilization?
Right. So the changes that were made that force people to take lower paying jobs or outside of their original job, that you lose that human capital that has been created if they have to take jobs outside of their normal work, and you end up with lower wages. So you lose capacity. The economy loses capacity. If you can keep those people in the higher paying jobs and related to the training they already have as closely as possible, then we end up with a more productive economy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you both. Turning to Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question directed for Glenn at the conference board. Glenn, we've had the last couple of months significant revisions to Canada's economic growth profile for 2016, where we've had a large downward revision in economic growth from the private sector forecasters. We've seen the output gap, if you want to call it my estimate, probably not closed quick enough or quickly enough as we had assumed. We have 10-year government rates at 1%, 30 years at, not even below 2%. So we have an historic moment where we can undertake strategic investments, as you commented in your opening remarks, where we undertake strategic investments in a prudent fashion, where we allow the debt to GDP ratio to decline, but at the same time we take advantage of slack in the labor markets, where stimulus is needed, investment is needed, and there's an infrastructure deficit. We've had the Bank of Canada governor comment that infrastructure spending and investment is an economic enabler. 2-3 months ago, Mr. Bernanke was in Toronto, where he opined the same thing. And we've also had the past governor, Mr. Dodge, come out vigorously for strategic investment in infrastructure across Canada. I would like to ask what your views are on the infrastructure spending that could occur in the coming months and that we think will occur and is needed, under the auspices that we continue to allow the debt to GDP ratio to decline and we provide mild stimulus spending, stimulus investment for the economy.
Well, a number of comments I can make. First of all, I think it's fair to say that most economists now think that we have to rebalance our macroeconomic strategy, that we've reached a point where cutting interest rates further is pushing on a string. So the Bank of Canada has basically done its job now, as central banks have around the world. So it is legitimate to think about adding a little bit of sort of a nudge forward in terms of fiscal stimulus. We've done a lot of work on infrastructure over the years. I think Canada has probably systematically underinvested in public infrastructure for about the last 30 years. I think you have to go back a long period of time. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities talks about a deficit of $175 billion across the country, just a shockingly high number, simply to maintain current urban infrastructure. So we're looking at a big bill. You can't fix that overnight. It's not a one-year plan. It's got to be almost a generational plan, finding more clever ways to dedicate federal, provincial, and city resources. And I guess that's one of the key pieces we've written about this, is having all three levels of government working in harmony together as a collective, because the feds have arguably more financing capacity, but don't have the line of sight that the other two levels of government do. So I would see a critical piece in this is coordination amongst three levels of government, working with cities and provinces to try and identify the most important projects, but also the ones that are going to give you the biggest payback over a generation.
And just to switch gear over to FIN, over the Atlantic provinces, we all are well aware of the demographic challenges facing the Atlantic Canada and the economic challenges in terms of where the commodity markets are going. So, in my estimation, our government's agenda to invest in innovation and to target strategic investments in innovation, with obviously innovation occurring in Atlantic Canada, is going to be key to getting that economy turned around, to getting growth back, and to reversing the brain drain, the internal brain drain that's occurring in Canada. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that tangent, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree entirely with the premises that of the point or the question. Innovation is very, very important. The question is, who is good at choosing where we invest in innovative processes, in technologies, in industries or sectors? And it's a mixed bag historically in looking across jurisdictions. Sometimes we get them right, often we get them wrong, and that is why I was, when I was describing, for example, a federal innovation box policy for the corporate income tax, it's the approach is silent. It's agnostic about exactly what it is or where it is that we adopt or pursue innovation, make use of intellectual property, and that I think is more likely to produce good outcomes because they're market driven. If I may I add on the infrastructure prioritization question, because I think there are great examples and bad ones, and there are the themes that Glenn enumerated. I generally agree with. We do need long-term investment, and that helps you prioritize. And the point that I was making earlier is that it's got to be productive and enhancing. So that speaks to things like transport linkages, ports, airports. That all works. I also strongly recommend for something quicker is the point raised by the Assembly on water quality. That is a terrific one. When we have boil water warnings, boil water isn't because of lead or mercury poisoning. It's biologic, bacterial or protozoan. We know how to deal with those things. We know how to fix it. The technology is off the shelf and not that expensive, and this investment would just have huge improvements for quality of life and productivity on reserve.
No, and I think we're all well aware of the productivity challenge we face as a nation. And that ties into our innovation agenda, whether it's going through the universities and allowing them to flourish in incubators and so forth. Our government agenda is on that tangent because we need to do better, and we will do better. Mr. Chair, I'd like to share my time with the Parliamentary Secretary.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to
You've
address
only
my
got
question.
about 20 seconds, so you have to make it quick.
Well, let me just quote you an IMF report, and I'd like to say to Mr. Hodgson to comment on that. It says, increased infrastructure investment on quality projects tend to raise output in both the short and long term without increasing debt to GDP ratio. I'd like to hear you on that. That's the IMF report talking about Canada. Can you comment on that, whether you agree, and what's your view on that?
As a first principle, yes. Our research, and we've done a lot of research for the federal government, for provinces and for cities, is that $1 invested gives you more than $1 payback for the economy. So it's one of the highest priority forms of stimulus spending we could imagine.
Thank you both. Mr. McCullman.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and I'd like to start with Mr. Williamson. You'd mentioned two items that are of interest to me as a previous small business owner. Control of the expense side of the balance sheet. It's all talk about spend, 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 and we've heard lots of it, and I'm sure we're going to get it. But you'd mentioned in your point number 2, control of what the federal government would have control of on the expense side, and that's the public sector costs of running government. And I wondered if you could just comment on one item that is currently timely in terms of what's going on there, and it's the public service sick leave benefit that has been floated, and what's going to happen with it. Do you have any thoughts regarding that?
Well, we've all seen the reports over the last couple of years about the gap that exists between the public sector and the private sector, and as well the cost of the current government system, and I think the need for reform. For two reasons, actually. One, of course, is cost savings that have been outlined in the past, but the other, of course, deals with the intergenerational equality, where a young public sector worker who comes on the job might not have the hours or days built up to take time off if illness strikes them at an early age. So it's a question, I think, of both fairness for all workers throughout the public sector system, but as well one of cost. And again, we're talking about changes on the margins here throughout the system. And we found in government that we're not talking about massive changes in a single year, but rather make these changes incrementally and they build up over time. You do this across the various spending outlets when it comes to public sector, pensions, sick leave, vacation pay, and pay, and you can actually realize significant savings over the medium term.
And I agree with that approach. You know, and it's very close to home. My son and daughter are both public sector workers, and I understand exactly what you're saying. But that balance between what was experienced as small businesses and small businesses in the country versus what the public sector going forward is moving towards is something that I think that should be taken into account when we're talking about bringing forward budgets. In the sense that every nickel matters. Every nickel matters to the bottom line in the end. The other point that you made was regarding incentives, and that I believe your words were that incentives matter. And just expand on who you think they matter to. Where do incentives work? Where do they not work? And can you give me your thoughts and perspective on that?
Well, I think incentives always matter, in that in any government program or system is going to incentivize people to behave one way or another. The challenge for policymakers, for the men and women in this room in Parliament, is to try to have the foresight when they put together programs to envision or to think through, if we do something, how is it going to impact the real world out there? And so, for example, I'm going to go back to the case I made, because it's one that is very topical right now in Atlantic Canada. There's a call, for example, to increase federal transfers for health care. And why is that? That is because we have an older demographic, and of course health care costs are going up. My emphasis back home to provincial policymakers is, well, that's fine, and we understand that challenge, but in order to address that, it's not just Ottawa that plays a role, but provinces as well have to take advantage of the resources and opportunities that are there for them to tackle. And far too often, a lifeline from the federal government can actually be helpful in the short term, but be detrimental in the long term. And I say that because if provinces are just turning to Ottawa for that lifeline, for problems that have existed for decades now, it doesn't serve them by changing what they're doing. So, for example, energy use is an opportunity we see that would create jobs, as are taking advantage of natural resources back home. The biggest struggle we have, for example, is men and women who go to Saskatchewan to work, for example, in the shale gas industry, an industry we haven't opened in New Brunswick, for example, and throughout the region. We're losing people to the very industry that we won't tackle or open up in Atlantic Canada, losing those young workers, and with them the tax base. So that's I think incentives always matter, and again it's trying to get at it. What are we trying to do, and how best do we help communities across the country?
One last question.
Mr. Grable.
Thank you for all the witnesses that came out and to present today. I do want to mention before I begin my question that the finance minister has an obligation to all Canadians and not just the 9.1 million that voted for the opposition parties. So I'm very excited that the minister will be here on Tuesday to present in front of this committee. My question is for Mr. Williamson. I know you've been a busy man today, so I'll keep it short. It's a good time to invest. There's low interest rates in the country, and we do have a declining debt to GDP ratio. And like the parliamentary secretary mentioned, that the IMF has basically said that Canada is in a great, unique position to invest in. And you mentioned in your testimony that infrastructure projects, may not be all that they're accustomed to be in terms of growth. And the government's made a pledge that it's going to spend its money wisely, that it should be on projects that stimulate growth in the short term and in the long term, and that we should benefit from a long-term perspective. In 2008, when the Obama administration came into power, they made a focus of spending money. And over their 8 years in power, we've seen a declining unemployment rate and growth rates at historical levels in the United States. For the same period in Canada, we haven't had that growth. And we've had, in the last 10 years, in the last decade, we've had the worst growth rate since World War II. And, you know, investment in infrastructure spending has always been seen as a way to stimulate the economy. So just your views on that and how the Atlantic provinces could benefit and should benefit from federal government spending in infrastructure.
Yeah, look, I want to be careful here. I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression. I certainly do not suggest that infrastructure spending can't be beneficial or is not beneficial for communities and for provinces. Far from it. My point was that the platform commitments that the Liberal Party made was a plan over the mandate. Increasingly, we're hearing, just get the money out the door quickly, we need to spend it. And I actually think that would be the wrong approach. And in fact, I think there have also been comparisons looking at how Canada spent its infrastructure money versus the Obama administration in its early years. And I don't quite agree with you that their growth records are well ahead of ours in Canada. I mean, until very recently, Canada had a lower unemployment rate than the United States. You're correct; they're beginning to take off now, but that actually has happened at the back end of the administration's term. Canada, for the longest, for a time, had a lower unemployment rate, something we haven't seen in generations in this country. So my point on this infrastructure spending is, take your time, do it well, do it over the next 4 years as you committed to in the campaign. Work with the provinces, work with municipalities. Don't let the public pressure you're now going to experience to get it all out in the first year see you fund programs or projects that actually won't have the long-term economic benefit that we want to see them have.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Poshman. You alluded to public transit as not being that important in terms of infrastructure spending, and you alluded to the Up Express experiment at Pearson to Toronto and how that financial model there doesn't work because the price for ridership is like $27 or something like that. But if you know, this weekend, because it was free Family Day weekend, ridership was almost 4 times. So the demand on terms of, from a public perspective, is there. And the financial models, yes. And there was an op-ed in the National Post last week about how it was, it was something designed by the private sector, and that's why it didn't work out. But the demand to get people moving in the country is still there. And just your comments on, the importance of public transit and how infrastructure spending can ensure that, the economy benefits overall.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just spent a little over 17 years working in downtown Toronto, so I'm a fan of things that will improve urban congestion. I think my point was it doesn't help everybody everywhere, and we really, really do have to prioritize where scarce dollars are spent. And I used Union Pearson as an example of something that plainly has not delivered. Maybe one day it will. We can just keep hoping, I guess, but don't hold your breath. The other point about transportation is it about moving goods, or is it about getting people to markets, or is it just about improving congestion, which is, congestion is a thing to be addressed, and addressing it is a thing of value, but is it the most important one? We'd look from an Atlantic perspective. Highways, they're actually not that bad, but we do have a choke point, which is important to the New Brunswick and Nova Scotian economies in particular, which is in Quebec, as the highway is in eastern Quebec. So your infrastructure investment in eastern Quebec would help a lot for people who are shipping goods to and from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. So you need to do the analysis.
I'll have to cut you there, Roger. Mr. Leipert.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here on short notice today. I think we gained a lot from all of your presentations. I happen to be the only member of this committee, member of Parliament from west of Winnipeg. And so I think I speak when I say this, that the Energy East pipeline is very important to the 3 western provinces. I was heartened to hear both the presenters from Atlantic Canada advocate for Energy East. We know that the federal cabinet will be making the decision to approve Energy East, and presumably that decision will be based on comprehensive review by the National Energy Board. But one other factor I would hope is that the federal cabinet will listen to the input from their caucus members, all of them who sit around this table today. I would ask if, as representatives of your region, whether you have been having these discussions with your members of Parliament in the regions in Atlantic Canada and expressing to them how important Energy East is. And after you answer that question, I would like to ask each one of the presenters today, simply yes or no, do you support the Energy East pipeline?
Who wants to start?
Well, I would like an answer from the two members from Atlantic Canada first.
Okay, from Mr. Williamson and Mr. Poshman.
Very quickly, the Energy East pipeline in New Brunswick has bipartisan support. The Liberals support it, the Conservatives support it, and the NDP support it. It has bipartisan support and overwhelming support. So the message, I think, is not only well known and well heard, it is by and large uniform across the province. Having said that, we're going to hear I think the position from the Aboriginal community. Negotiations and discussions are ongoing there, as they are with communities that will be that the pipeline could well traverse through. But there is overwhelming support at home for the pipeline.
Mr. Poshman.
Thank you. Yes, the support is bipartisan. It's federal and provincial in my experience, and perhaps more important, not only at the political level, but in general at the community level.
Does anybody else want to add anything? Mr. Hodgson.
We've actually done the analysis on both the Trans Mountain project and the Energy East project, and the numbers are clear. The economic benefits from both projects we're seeing are massive. And one of the biggest benefits, I mean, there's a construction period, an operation period, but the real benefit is getting a real price for the product, because the Western Select discount is massive, and we have to find a way to capture the benefit of a world price. But of course, the decision is political. We're nonpartisan, so I'm not going to give you a vote.
Anybody else? Mr. Leclerc?
Here's what I would say, is that we don't have a mandate to tell you yes or no. But here's what we would like to hear, is that this government will absolutely listen to the rights holders that are affected by the pipeline, and listen and engage them. So that would be our answer.
Ms. McEwen, do you want to add?
I also don't have a mandate to say yes or no, but our position is that oil should be moved in the safest way possible, that there should be environmental guidelines for moving that, and that those jobs are critical in Atlantic Canada.
Mr. Leipert.
And I would ask Mr. Hodgson then as well, not only the benefits, but have you done the assessment on the amount of money the country is losing based on importing foreign oil into Atlantic Canada?
Short answer, no. We focus on the analysis of the two pipeline projects, and the benefits are construction jobs, operation jobs, and revenues for both levels of government, both provincial and federal, and getting the world price for the product.
Time for one more, Ron.
I'm good.
You good? Okay, turning to Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for everyone for the opportunity that you've come here and presented to us. I think I'll start with Ms. McEwen in terms of the Canadian Labour Congress. And you talk about having more women in trades and more, I guess, the non-traditional workers in the labour union. How do you propose this? Because especially given the commitment for infrastructure, if there is a boost in this sector, it would be extremely helpful for the country to have not only a boost in the sector, but for the workforce itself. So what is your organization and probably other organizations doing to diversify the workforce?
Thank you. So unions like Unifor and the Canadian Building Trades unions have programs that run the gamut because it is a complex problem. So there are pre-apprenticeship programs that try to attract, say, women or underrepresented workers to have them get some of the skills necessary to enter the trades. They mentor people at work, and they try to provide a work environment. I was in the Naval Reserve, so I've worked in very male-dominated environments, and there are sometimes cultures that arise that are hostile to people from outside of that culture. So they work with mentors to try to change the culture to make it more welcoming to people who are coming through, because it's not just obviously getting them into the training, it's getting people to complete the training and into jobs.
Okay. Thank you. My next question is in regards to Mr. Hodgson, in regards to your comments about the changing the tax system. given that you have a short amount of time, but could you highlight or elaborate a little bit on some of the pieces that you'd like us to look at specifically or that you think would have a big impact? I know it's probably a complex issue and a complex question, and can you do it in a very short time, but could you elaborate a little?
Well, I think the starting point is that for example, our personal income tax system is in theory a self-administered system, but probably 2/3 of us or more now pay somebody else to actually do our taxes for us. And that's a sign that maybe we've kind of gone a step too far in terms of building the complexity of our system. Same thing on the business side. About most estimates would say that businesses spend between 1% and 2% of their operating expenses just simply complying with the tax system. So there's a good starting point. There's a lot of personal time and revenue and business time and revenue that's being expended complying with a very complex tax system. We know from Finance Canada that we have $100 billion in revenue leakage, some of which are on things that we would all value, like the RSP, for example. But maybe it's time to step back and think about how we can have a tax system that actually boosts the productivity and performance of our economy, rather than one that just captures revenue and then selectively provides incentives to different interest groups.
Great, thank you very much. And question to Mr. Williamson. You mentioned and you used this analogy of teaching provinces to fish. So you want the provinces to learn to fish, but you kind of want the federal government to implement Energy East without all of the stakeholders or their social license. How do we teach provinces and other groups to fish if we take back the rod or give it to them when the federal government sees fit? Wouldn't having the social license actually be exactly what you're suggesting, teaching them to fish, because we'd be listening?
Interesting question. I guess the Energy East was kind of a tagline at the end. I just wanted to make the point just how important that is. The Energy East is something that the provinces do want to do. They'll do that in partnership, I think, with the federal government review, which is ongoing now before the National Energy Board. My point was really that just providing additional transfers to Atlantic Canada is not helping Atlantic Canada over the long term. You might think you're helping in the short term, but if the policies are not geared to growth locally, people are going to leave. I mean, look at Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan had a problem 15 years ago where people were leaving to Alberta to find work, and the province hadn't grown since the dirty 30s, and the economy was flatlined. Under the NDP, no less, they fixed their balance sheet, they reformed the tax code to take advantage of resources, and they continue that under the Saskatchewan Party. That's the kind of thinking I think we need in Atlantic Canada, where we're going to take advantage of our opportunities. So it's not a question of necessarily teaching Atlantic Canadians anything. I think Atlantic Canadians need to be liberated to take advantage of their economy. But too often, provinces are focused on maximizing revenues from Ottawa and not looking at what they can do in their own backyard to generate growth, economic opportunity, and to create jobs.
Thank you, Jennifer. Before I turn to Mr. Caron, I had one question for Mr. Hodgson. You talked about $100 billion in revenue leakage. Do you have some examples of that?
Well, we have more than 180 tax expenditures now built into our tax code for individuals and for businesses. And when you add up all the expenditures where we're giving people credit, for example, for different activities, you end up losing more than $100 billion annually in revenue. This is numbers that are actually calculated by Finance Canada on their website. And that's a starting point for me, to ask questions about whether we're getting value for money from $100 billion from revenue foregone. And again, some of it's on good things. Like, I don't think anybody would argue that the RSP has not been really fundamental to our retirement savings. But I do think it's time to have a fundamental review of the working of our tax system. Finn, you were part of the review of our business tax about 20 years ago. We got some benefit from that, but I think we have to go the next step and really ask yourself whether we have a tax system that works for all Canadians and all Canadian businesses, or is too chopped up to really provide any benefit.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Caron, 3 minutes.
Très rapidement, c'est pas une question, Madame.
Very quickly, this is not a question, Ms. McEwen, but when we spoke of your study on employment insurance as an economic stabilizer, you mentioned that the existence of that program means that a recession or economic downturn is reduced by 14%. Could you give the committee a document or study to support that statistic?
Yes, I can send an email to the clerk. I have a PDF of the study that I can send from HRSTC.
Ce serait très apprécié. Monsieur Pashman.
I would really appreciate that. Mr. Poshman, Mr. Hutchins, you mentioned infrastructure. You said one of the important things is to invest where you're going to get a return on investment. I think we're in agreement. But I would like to know what your interpretation is of the idea of an investment that could increase productivity or get returns on investment. Thank you for the question.
I think the short answer is to contemplate investment in terms of private returns and public returns. So we're used to private investments where we look for a particular return on equity, return on investment. In the case of public infrastructure, we look for returns that are more broadly spread. In other words, I used transport linkages and ports as an example because they improve the functioning of the businesses and individuals who take advantage of exactly those things. So you have a public return that we consider, that we contemplate when we evaluate public infrastructure investments. It is what I worry about, though, is the idea that infrastructure is necessarily good, or that a dollar spent on infrastructure produces more than a dollar of return, because it vitally depends on what, and I could just as easily turn that into 50 cents as $1.50.
Monsieur Hudson?
I can't approve on that answer.
Oui, mais rapidement, en fait, lorsqu'on parle d'infrastructure, je suis d'accord avec vous au niveau.
Quickly, I agree with you about ports and roads and airports, and we need to increase our free trade agreements and international trade. But there's also investments that can allow communities to engage in economic development. I'm talking about smaller scale programs like Health Canada. We're talking about better bandwidth for the regions so that they have more capacities with high-speed internet. Right now, there's an absence of funding for cellular towers. Does this lack of funding for high-speed internet in the regions, it may not be something that affects big cities, but can that affect overall economic growth? And would you see that as productive investment? And would that enable us to elicit returns on investment?
That's a tough one.
Very quick if you can.
Okay.
At a time. Mr.
Can I have the fishing
definitions
question?
quick.
You can just come over to my house. I got mackerel in the backyard. It really depends. Yes, where you have denser areas, it's going to be easier to make a business case for internet service. In rural areas, the business case is harder to make, but I don't jump to the assumption that publicly funded high-speed or high bandwidth communication is the right answer, because we do have other technologies. Satellite is imperfect, but it is one. So you have to ask yourself, is it really the most important thing for this community?
Mike is.
Thank you all for your presentations, and I certainly want to thank you for bringing forward your information and your briefs on such short notice. We know you didn't have a lot of time, and for 7 members of Parliament here, this is their first committee meeting, so thank you all as well. We'll suspend for 5 witnesses while we bring forward the next, or for 5 minutes while we bring forward the next witnesses. Thank you. people can have a sandwich while people are speaking. So, who's first up?
We have them sitting in order this time, which is much easier. So, Mr. Miller, Greenberg.
Okay, who are we? We'll wait one more sec for Mr. Chapin to come. All right, if we could start with Mr. Mueller with the Canada Green Building Council. Mr. Mueller, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Chair. The building sector represents a significant opportunity to reduce carbon emissions and other environmental impacts. In Canada, over 30% of emissions come from the building sector. The green building industry over the last 10 years has developed a capacity and a knowledge to deliver results on carbon emission reductions with positive return on investment. In 2014, the industry supported 298,000 jobs and generated $23 billion in GDP. However, taking action would require investment, as the construction sector in Canada ranks at the bottom of all industries in terms of its expenditures in research and development. So our proposal, the Canada Green Building Council is proposing a national cross-sector building strategy led by industry and supported by the Government of Canada to accelerate the transition towards a low-carbon built environment. Our focus would be on making efficiency gains. Building efficiency is the most cost-effective option by far to achieve tangible results. What are our recommendations? Number one, invest in government-owned buildings. The Government of Canada is the largest building owner in Canada and has an opportunity to show leadership in reducing carbon emissions and environmental impacts from a significantly larger number of its own buildings. The government could consider updating its current green building policy for real property, pursuing higher performance targets for all new construction projects to a level of LEED Gold or better. And the government could also consider start certifying its portfolio of large existing buildings under LEED. Such an initiative would require a cross-departmental initiative, including a public service and procurement, a real property branch, as well as custodial departments. Our second recommendation is around supporting energy benchmarking initiatives across Canada. 50% of existing buildings will still be in use by 2050. Therefore, we consider it to be vital to focus on the existing building stock with a potential of a 20 to 40% reduction of energy consumption and carbon emissions. Energy benchmarking, reporting, and disclosure are critical strategies in engaging building owners in reducing energy use. Several jurisdictions in the U.S. have already adopted mandatory policies, ranged from cities of New York, Chicago, Seattle, and so on. And in Canada, policies are under development at the provincial and local level, including the province of Ontario, City of Vancouver, and the province of BC. In this regard, we recommend that the Government of Canada invest in the development and delivery of a national industry-led program to support benchmarking efforts across Canada. The government could establish a national center of excellence on building performance. A second strategy would be to provide direct funding for provinces or cities to support their policies by incentivizing, or better, provide financing to owners to help them drive down energy use. The third strategy would be to invest in the expansion of Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is actually operated by Natural Resources Canada for the last 3 years. And the expansion would be to include more building types and reporting capabilities to support the national benchmarking efforts. Our final recommendation is with regards to moving towards net zero emission buildings. It is essential at this time that we advance the design of net zero emission buildings as a key component of a low carbon building strategy. This requires investment in applied research and development to support the industry development capacity, knowledge, and technologies to deliver net zero buildings in larger numbers. This approach would drive innovation in Canada by investing in the next generation of buildings with a significantly lower carbon footprint, and align well with the federal government's leadership and commitment to climate change targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mueller, and thank you as well for the brief. I don't think you put that together, that 105 pages, over the weekend.
Yeah.
Mr.
Well, it was our pleasure to do that.
Thank you. With the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Dennis Laycraft. Welcome, Dennis.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and it's terrific to be here. And it's nice to see a couple familiar faces that understand and know agriculture as well as certainly our chairman and Ron does. On behalf of Canada's 68,500 beef cattle operations, we're grateful to receive this invitation. In 2014, the cattle industry generated $9.8 billion in farm cash receipts and was the largest source of farm income in Canada. We expect in 2015 we'll top $10 billion. Our industry is one of the positive stories in our national economy and has the potential to continue growing. Global demand for high-quality beef is increasing as economies grow around the world, and we produce the best beef in the world right here in Canada. We're also leading the world on our sustainability work. We're an industry that depends on trade. Almost half of our production is exported, and the U.S. Is our largest customer, but we also export to many other countries. Export sales complement our domestic market and generate exceptional value for our producers. We estimate that almost $500 per head additional value is generated by selling a range of beef and beef offal products that Canadians may not like, but are delicacies in other parts of the world. Simply put, trade is vital to our future prosperity. The overarching objective I'd like to imprint on the committee would be the need to help the Canadian beef sector compete against international beef competitors here in Canada and around the world. That takes investment in both opening export markets and ensuring we have a competitive and innovative domestic industry. It is paramount that the Trans-Pacific Partnership be approved and implemented as quickly as possible so that we can reclaim Japanese customers lost to Australian beef who currently benefit from a free trade agreement in that market and have lower tariffs than we do going into that market. Furthermore, if we're not part of the Trans-Pacific and the other members are, we will ultimately lose all access to that market. We also want to see progress on addressing the technical barriers to Canadian beef in Europe and then have the CETA come into effect. There are some plant approval issues that still require work, and it's important that we bring dedicated resources to addressing those in a timely manner that results in commercially meaningful beef exports. As we found out, once various trade agreements are implemented, there are often issues that arise later on. This is why we advocated for the creation of the Agriculture Market Access Secretariat, and we'd ask that the Agriculture Market Access Secretariat be fully funded so it can continue to carry out its important work in paving the way for Canadian agri-food exports. And one thing I will say is that we truly believe Canadian agri-food exports will continue to be an engine of growth for our country. We also ask that there be sufficient funding to support incoming missions of foreign government inspectors, since it is often a prerequisite to export approval. In recent years, that cost has been downloaded to the industry, but it's really bringing foreign regulators in to assess our regulatory and our inspection systems to ensure it meets their conditions. One of the key ways the government can facilitate a competitive Canadian agriculture sector is to help us innovate by investing in research. Industry government-funded research clusters have been one of the great success stories in Canada. We strongly support continuing this exceptional approach to collaborative research and encourage the Government of Canada to continue to maintain and modernize its research infrastructure. On environmental sustainability, we've created the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, and we're working with McDonald's on their first ever pilot project to source verified sustainable beef. To ensure we continue to be a world leader, we encourage the government to support ranchers' conservation actions and to ensure funds are available for the continuation and expansion of agri-environmental programs and the development of market-based instruments. Collaborative research on beneficial management practices and adaptive management approach to implementing and incentivizing them is more efficient than an expansive and expensive regulatory framework. Investment in infrastructure is also needed. A major water management project in Manitoba is long overdue to mitigate the impact of flooding of agricultural lands largely caused by water diversion. Expanded port and border facilities to eliminate the bottlenecks that we often occur trying to export our products remains very important. As well as we look at Northern Ontario, there's the opportunity to release some federal and provincial crown lands for sale to go back into agriculture production. We also need to modernize our research facilities. A number of them have required some investment for a period of time, and it again is very important to the work that's done in our industry. I also want to talk about labor shortages that are really preventing more value-added processing from occurring right here in Canada. There's a shortage of people willing to work in Canadian agriculture and agri-food processing. This is a chronic and a long-term challenge that will only get worse looking at Canada's workforce demographics. We need viable immigration programs as an integrated component of a national agriculture labor strategy. And we're also looking to work as we deal with a number of the refugees coming in, and that we view that as an important stream as well, but long term we need adequate solutions to people that want those positions. Risk management. Cattle production is a long-term business that involves many risks. We have long recommended that federal government ensure that there be sufficiently funded national business risk management programs. We also support some flexibility in the government contribution to regional provincial livestock insurance programs, assuming that the overall level of support is even across the country and the programs are market neutral. We believe the Western Livestock Price Insurance is a forward-looking market-based insurance-style program that's designed to be actuarially sound that allows producers to manage price risk. It's a pilot project and should be made permanent. And I want to talk just quickly on capital requirements. Cattle prices have increased in the past few years to record levels. For many producers who purchase cattle for breeding, backgrounding, or finishing, their credit requirements have almost doubled. And the limits on lending programs will need to reflect this new reality as we move forward. In closing, our sector encourages finance policies and a fiscal environment that supports long-term growth and continuous improvement through innovation, collaboration, and that expands our ability and capability to competitively produce and market our products to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And turning to Ms. Berube, I guess this thick presentation is yours.
Thank you, Honourable Chair.
Welcome.
Committee members, thank you for inviting the Green Budget Coalition to present before you today. You should have before you our comprehensive recommendations for Budget 2016. The Green Budget Coalition represents 16 national environmental organizations, and we've been operating since 1999. We make an annual submission to the federal government to ensure that the federal government has the resources to address the most pressing issues regarding environmental sustainability in Canada. This year, the focus of our Budget 2016 recommendation is to make sure that the federal departments and their respective ministers have the resources to deliver the commitments and the mandate letters of the new government, but also to deliver on some ongoing statutory obligations and international commitments. So I will take you very briefly through our detailed recommendations. With regards to clean energy and climate change leadership, we make a series of recommendations for strategic federal investment in advancing the generation of renewable energy in Canada, and this includes modernizing the electrical distribution grid and providing some fiscal incentives for electricity storage technologies that are absolutely critical to ensure Canada meets its full renewable energy generation potential. Complementary to renewable energy, we make a series of recommendations on energy efficiency and to encourage energy conservation in Canadian homes and businesses, and this includes a national home energy retrofit plan with a grant for low-income families to be able to access and to retrofit their homes. We also make recommendations to begin a complete phase-out of all the tax preferences to the fossil fuel industry sector. As you know, this is a commitment that Canada made to the G20 and that is in the current mandate letter of the Minister of Finance. So we want to see a complete phase-out of the tax preferences to the fossil fuel sectors over the next 5 years. Complementary to that, we would like to see a review of the public financing portfolio of Export Development Canada as Export Development Canada continues to provide public financing financing to the oil and gas sectors for explorations overseas. We have a recommendation to develop a national carbon pricing standard to ensure that we reach a common coordinated carbon price across Canada of at least $50 per ton of CO2 by 2020. We also make a very comprehensive series of recommendations to protect our changing Arctic from the impacts of climate change, and that includes ensuring the safety of marine transportation and building climate-resilient infrastructure and bring renewable and energy efficiency projects in Canada's north. With regards to infrastructure spending, and this is about to be a very large investment of this government, we want to make sure that any federal funding for infrastructure meets some strict criteria to make sure that it meets core policy objectives to reduce greenhouse gases emission, sequester carbon, and enhance the resiliency of our communities against climate change. We also recommend a minimum investment of $2 billion per year for public transit in Canada. And we make a series of recommendations to bring green infrastructure in First Nations communities, as well as ensuring clean drinking water across First Nation communities. With regards to Canada's international conservation commitments, the Government of Canada has made commitments under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity to protect 17% of our land and inland waters by 2020. This requires investment in areas of strict federal jurisdiction, including species at risk protection, creating new national parks, creating national wildlife areas, and protecting migratory birds. The Government of Canada, under the same convention, also committed to protecting 10% of our oceans by 2020, and this will require significant federal investment to create new marine protected areas and to improve ocean science and monitoring. Finally, we see it critical that private landowners be engaged and supported and compensated for their stewardship initiative and contribute to meeting our international conservation commitments. We make a recommendation to engage Canadians in nature, to make sure Canadians have the opportunity to experience the outdoors, and to create employment opportunities for youth in the environmental sector. With regards to protecting Canada's fresh water, we recommend the creation of a Canada Water Fund to make sure that Canadian clean technology sector implements the best wastewater treatment technologies and water quality monitoring. We also have some international commitment with regards to the Great Lakes Water Quality Protocol that will require significant new federal funding in order to deliver on those commitments. And our final series of recommendations is related to healthy environments and healthy Canadians, ensuring that we address inequity and environmental risk exposure within the Canadian population. And we would like to see a new tax credit being provided so that Canadians can remediate the impacts of radon in their homes. So this is a very brief overview of our comprehensive submission for this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Berube. Mr. Obed, and I'll get you to name your organization because I'll not have it right.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Honourable Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Natan Obed. I am the president of Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, the representational voice for Canada's 60,000 Inuit. From Nunatsiavut in the east to the Inuvialuit region in the Western Arctic. We're at a very interesting point in time in the relationship between the Government of Canada and its Indigenous peoples, and we're very excited as Inuit to explore the renewal of the Inuit to Crown relationship within the overarching nation-to-nation discussion that the Prime Minister has started. In many ways, we can renew this relationship through governance and through working together in different ways that will allow for greater efficiencies and greater access to programs or services or sort of political voice. That doesn't necessarily cost any money, but there are going to be major investments that are necessary to renew the relationship, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. First off, we have to consider the Inuit-specific lens that we put on any sort of investments that happen in our regions. Every single speech from the throne, every single budget, every major funding announcement we listen to to see if the Government of Canada understands the complexity of Indigenous jurisdictions and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And time again, we as Inuit find ourselves left out or only partially covered or covered in a way that does not reflect the realities in which we live in. Whether it's the recent speech from the throne talking about First Nations education instead of Indigenous education, or a northern strategy that excludes 2 of the 4 Inuit regions in Canada. The terminology that is used and the way in which the specific wording is in budgets or in any sort of announcements has great implications for Inuit. And that if the government would like to do its best for Indigenous people, that it needs to do a better job of how it phrases the work and is honest about who is inside and who is outside the funding envelope. So I believe that Canada can do better in articulating exactly what investments will be for Inuit, what investments will be for First Nations, what will be for Métis, or what will be Indigenous in scope. And it isn't as if we are looking for a relationship that is exclusive or inclusive completely. Well, we don't live on reserves. We have 4 comprehensive land claim agreements that create the governance space for all of our interactions with the federal government. So we do not fall under the Indian Act. But it is very important that right from the beginning, we have a very clear sense of what investments are made for us and not have to figure it out after the fact. Because First Nations is used sometimes as instead of Indigenous, or Indigenous is used when it only means certain Indigenous peoples in Canada. I'll speak very briefly about some of our top priorities. The first is in relation to infrastructure. I think Canada still is incomplete in its building process. We do not have the infrastructure in our 53 communities that in the Arctic that many people enjoy in southern Canada. We still don't have ports in many of our communities, even though all but 2 of our communities are marine communities. We still have diesel generation that powers all of our communities in an age where we're looking to better and cleaner energy alternatives. This is completely unacceptable. We have lack of connectivity or decreased connectivity than most Canadians because of the expense of connectivity in the Arctic and the limitations from the satellites that provide it. We believe that Canada can make investments to ensure that the connectivity in the Arctic is just as good as the connectivity in southern Canada. We also have massive infrastructure issues in relation to getting goods and services in and out of our communities. Just about all of our communities have marine access in the summer and only air access in the winter, fly in, fly out. We have some communities that have ice roads and some communities that do have roads year-round, but those are very, very minute in number. So the investments that Canada makes in the infrastructure in Inuit communities helps build Canada. It helps build sovereignty and the discussion about sovereignty in Canada, but it also allows for economic development to happen. We also have a housing crisis in our regions, and we need large investments in ensuring that we do not live in overcrowding conditions that we are currently under now, where over half of our people live in overcrowded social housing conditions. That brings me to our social envelope, and there are many discussions that have been had over the past 3 or 4 months about improving the lives of Indigenous Canadians and specifically for Inuit. So I will start with the government's commitments of the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, the implementation on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the inquiry for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We will expect that the budget will include funding to implement those three very large, very comprehensive, and very much needed different scopes of work that will be reflective of Inuit as well as the other Indigenous Canadians in a way that is respectful and comprehensive.
And if I could get you to sum up, we're a fair bit over. If you can sum up pretty quickly.
Sure. We also have a number of different mental health and health-related initiatives that we hope to see funding, especially in relation to suicide and suicide prevention. The last thing I would like to add is Inuit organizations have taken huge hits over the last decade. The framework of Inuit organizations from the community level to the international level have been undercut and undermined by funding cuts, and that this war on our people and the way in which we try to help one another and represent ourselves to Canada and the world needs to end, and we need funding to be able to ensure that we can provide services in the community level and the regional level, and that we can represent ourselves at the national and international levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Obid. Mr. Chartier with the Métis National Council. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to address your committee on the upcoming federal budget and the Métis Nation. The Métis Nation is greatly impressed by the adoption of a Métis Nation policy by the current government. This policy, Advancing and Achieving Reconciliation for the Métis Nation, is a far-reaching plan for the government to work in partnership with the Métis Nation on a nation-to-nation basis to further Métis self-government and economic prosperity. The starting point for reconciliation, in my view, is a commitment to begin processes for settling land claims and advancing self-government. The Métis Nation policy also rightly recognizes the critical importance of certain programs and services for our people and the proven track record of Métis Nation governments in their delivery. It makes a number of commitments which we trust will find their way into the budget, including a $25 million investment over 5 years in the Métis Economic Development Strategy, the renewal and expansion of the Aboriginal Strategic Employment and Training Strategy, or ASSETS, and the enhancement of existing scholarships and bursaries available to Métis students at various colleges and universities in partnership with the Métis Nation. The government's policy commitments to convert funding to the Métis National Council's governing members for Métis identification and registration into a permanent initiative to ensure an ongoing and reliable base of funding is very much appreciated. We welcome this initiative, and we see its inclusion in the budget as a first step in overhauling the overall federal funding system for the Métis Nation to put it on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis. We also welcome the whole-of-government approach of the new government in its dealings with Indigenous peoples' governments. The Prime Minister has set the stage for our engagement with multiple federal ministers and in the intergovernmental process on key issues like the Health Accord and climate change. While welcoming this opportunity, we are woefully underfunded and under-equipped to participate effectively under the current funding system. I believe the government is aware of this challenge and is preparing to boost our capacity to be able to participate meaningfully in the unfolding talks and processes. This critical requirement for expanding resources should also be addressed in the budget. Past efforts to getting Métis Nation-specific asks into the budget have been few and unsuccessful. For example, while asked by former Prime Minister Harper to submit a stimulus proposal for budget 2009, we ended up completely left out. The federal denial of jurisdiction for Métis served as a barrier, and the Métis had no one in the government to fight for our interests. The Daniels case before the Supreme Court of Canada and the strong likelihood of its confirmation of federal jurisdiction for the Métis under Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867 will likely reinforce the evolution of a new relationship between Ottawa and the Métis Nation that has already started under the Trudeau government's Métis Nation policy. At the same time, the long history of our budget item asks being overlooked altogether, or in the few cases when they were put forward, ending up on the cutting floor, makes us naturally vigilant. We will continue to work with the government to ensure their bold commitments are put into effect and encourage this committee to support us in these efforts. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chartier. And Mr. McClellan with the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to come. I have our presentation in hard copy in English only because of the turnaround time. If you'd like copies of it, they're here. Mr. Chairman, in recent years, Saskatchewan has been one of the primary economic engines keeping the Canadian economy stable, while other parts of the country were experiencing reduced economic activity. Saskatchewan's economic growth has temporarily slowed during the current downturn, but given the diversified mix of industries in our province, we will be well positioned to benefit as the global economy and commodity prices recover. In order to take advantage of this future recovery, however, there are some particular issues that the Government of Canada could greatly help with in the meantime. While we certainly applaud the recent decision and announcement by the federal government to fast-track $300 million towards Saskatchewan-based infrastructure projects, not all of the things we're here to ask for today cost money to make them happen. While Saskatchewan and most Western provinces continue to be impacted by the downturn in commodity prices, long-term growth targets are contingent on businesses being able to access the skilled personnel they need when they need them. That requires a reliable, expeditious immigration system that complements but not replaces our domestic workforce development. As an example, we believe the Canada Job Grant is an effective government program. Given recent changes, though, to the federal immigration system and the temporary foreign worker program, we must increase our efforts to develop the workforce within our province by expanding this initiative and increasing its flexibility for use by business. Since Saskatchewan is not currently able to use all of the federal money allocated to the province for the program during each fiscal year, we ask for greater flexibility to be introduced for the province to use the surplus money for other training and labour market development initiatives. Next, there's a close correlation between after-tax business profits and a number of key economic indicators, including government revenues. It's important that Canada maintain a current tax regime that leads not only North America in competitiveness, but the world. Increasingly, the subsidy for healthy food provided through Nutrition North Canada is another item the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce advocates for, and we encourage the federal government to focus on. Our province's remote northern communities currently receive the lowest subsidy available through the program. While there needs to be criteria in place to determine the eligibility of the communities to participate in a program like this, using their participation in the previous food mail program as a benchmark for their needs is a flawed process. By ensuring the issues that face Aboriginal people across the country are being fixed with the level of focused planning and funding necessary should also be a priority for the federal government. Creating solutions with clear timeframes, implementation plans, and full costing is a critical part of improving the lives of these Canadians. One of Saskatchewan's greatest untapped strengths is our large Aboriginal population. But one of our greatest failures as a province, and I would suggest as a country, has been our continuing inability to help them fully participate in our economy across this nation. A concerted effort is also required on infrastructure renewal. accompanied by strategic and sustained levels of federal investment. It's fundamental to protecting the future prosperity of our province. Again, we applaud the recent decision of fast-tracking the $300 million. Also, the ability of our producers and extractors to move their commodities is directly tied to economic growth. Farmers must ship their grain in order to purchase new equipment, and mining companies must transport their resources to invest in new jobs and new technologies. The federal government must capitalize on all levers available to improve rail access in terms of frequency, modal choice, and cost competitiveness. The growing role of rail in transporting crude oil is largely a result of our current pipeline access becoming increasingly constrained. For this reason, the Government of Canada must start supporting and promoting Canadian pipeline projects to a much greater extent. While it's important to give these types of projects appropriate safety and environmental consideration, we cannot continue to play divisive political games with them. If we keep doing this, our caution is that our country will lose out on opportunities for increasing foreign investment, creating jobs, and growing the Canadian economy. Back to Saskatchewan's north for just a second. Further investments into building and maintaining northern roads and high-quality internet connectivity are additional infrastructure items that the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce urges the federal government to focus on. By enhancing the physical and digital connection between our province's northern communities and the rest of Saskatchewan and Canada, we will improve their ability to learn, improve their access to health services, and their ability to run businesses from their unique geographic locations. Our province is one that is built on exports. That's why a fair and reciprocal access to both domestic and international markets are fundamental to stimulate investment, create jobs, and drive long-term growth. Saskatchewan businesses support the ratification and quick implementation of both the CETA agreement and the TPP. We encourage this government to do it. Saskatchewan businesses are ready, willing, and able to work with the Government of Canada to help build Canada. Please ensure, as we move forward, that we move forward together. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. McClellan. Thank you all for your presentations. We'll start the first round, and because we run into a hard stop at 2 o'clock, we'll go 6-minute rounds rather than the usual 7, starting with Mr. Greywall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you all for coming out and presenting today. My first question is for Mr. Laycroft. As you mentioned in your testimony, the U.S. is your largest export market, and on December 18, 2015, the U.S. passed a bill to repeal country of origin on beef and pork. Can you elaborate quickly on how quickly the membership of your organization will benefit from the repeal of this legislation, and how important it is for it to be repealed ongoing in your industry?
Thanks for that question. It was, I think, first of all, a great victory for the work of the Government of Canada as we fought close to 5 years of legal dispute to get through that. But the rules were unfairly discriminating against the exports of live cattle and hogs to the U.S., which meant every time we sold an animal, there was anywhere but around about a $45 a head discount on Canadian animals going south, either as feeder cattle or as animals direct for processing down there. That reduces the price spread between, so there's an immediate price impact there, but longer term, the demand for Canadian cattle and hogs in the U.S. will increase. Visiting with a number of feedlots, when we talk about our quality of our beef, the quality of our cattle are also amongst the very best in the world. And they believe that the cattle they import from Canada have the best rate of gain, and they're the most efficient animals that they feed all year. So that increases the price of every animal in Canada, whether we feed and process them in Canada or export them. And getting back to a functioning integrated North American market is great for our industry, and we believe we'll start to spur more growth in our cow herd.
Just to follow up, you mentioned that there's a shortage of workforce in your industry, and that the immigration program should be reformed to accommodate. Can you elaborate on what type of programs you're thinking? Like, would it be a provincial nominee program, developing another skilled category to help address the shortage in your industry?
We've worked on a labour strategy and working through the Canadian through CARC to come up with a comprehensive strategy. So it's probably all of the above when it comes down to it. But we do need to have access to a labor pool that are, first of all, interested in the positions. As we bring in employees to work in our packing plants, and a lot of them come from other parts of the world, that we're coming under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. With those employees, we had a retention rate almost towards 97%. If you were to take a look at when we were just simply, when we could find people to work in those jobs from the local communities, that retention rate was below 50% and oftentimes as low as 15% if you look over the course of a year. So you're going to have quality-based systems. You need people that want those jobs and are prepared to make an investment. Our issue with the temporary was we were never looking for a temporary foreign workers program. We wanted to bring people in to fill these jobs that want to become Canadians and want to become permanent employees in these organizations and these processing operations. So there isn't one quick answer to your question. It's all of these, and we're hoping, as I mentioned earlier, as a number of new people will become Canadians who are refugees today, that a number of them will look to find careers in our industry as well.
Thank you. My next question is for Annie. In your report, you have some funding allocated to electric vehicle rebates and infrastructure, and you're basing it on the model in Ontario. If there's widespread adoption of electric vehicles, there's a report out there that says that the grid wouldn't be able to accommodate, and we'd have a major crash. A lot of this is left to the provincial level, and where do you see the federal government playing a role? And do you not think that this is mostly should be handled on the infrastructure side by industry? Like in America, Tesla has built the coast-to-coast network of recharging stations, and just your comments on that.
Yeah. Your comment is right about the electrical grid. There is no doubt that there needs to be some investment in modernizing the Canadian electrical grid, and this is an area of shared jurisdiction. Our specific recommendation is that we give funding to Natural Resources Canada to lead the development of a transition plan with the provinces and the territories to modernize the electrical grid. We would like to see some more east-west connections to bring renewable energy across the country. The grid needs to be modernized to be able to accommodate electrical transportation and the intermittent nature of renewable energy. So this is our recommendation. Part of our recommendation is also to bring a lot of the renewable energy potential that is in Canadian North to the major centers, so we need some grid extensions there. So whether the funding comes through an infrastructure portfolio, to us it doesn't matter. I mean, we've made it in the context of this low carbon economy trust that the government is proposing. Certainly could be part of the proposed infrastructure funding that the federal government is going to put forward. With regards to your comment on Tesla and the private sector, I mean, we see the generation and the adoption of electrical vehicle as a public good in Canada because of our commitment to reducing greenhouse gases emission and also to improving local air quality. So we believe there's a role for the federal government to play specifically in providing rebate for the purchase of electrical vehicles, but also in supporting charging stations across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Graywell. Turning to Mr. McColman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start with Mr. Mueller and on the your suggestions regarding buildings and taking them to a level of zero emission buildings, I think you mentioned. And I just need a little bit of a clarification. Can you tell me what you're thinking in terms of energy benchmarks? This would be something, depending on the region of the country, each region would have energy benchmarks, because obviously, depending on the climate in each parts of the country, give me a little bit more detail on how you perceive the outcome of that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it would. That's a very good point. It would vary by region because the fuel mix in a different region is quite, some are based on coal, some are based on hydro. So the benchmarks that we would strive for would vary from region to region. So that's correct. So part of the initiative, one of the first steps would be to actually define what net zero emission building would mean by region. So you have to really establish the metrics. But when we talk about not necessarily only net zero, but we talk about low carbon buildings, that means is we need to define at what point a building would qualify to be low carbon, because we have to move the industry slowly towards that goal. We're at about 50% energy efficiency, maybe 60, and we need to get about to 80 and 90 over time. So it is really important to define the metric and then move towards it and how it can be achieved. Because we already have net zero buildings, but we want a larger number of buildings.
Do you have much knowledge of international experience where there are jurisdictions leading the way in the world on energy efficiency in terms of construction?
I would say I would have to say to Europe, Western and Northern Europe. They have been over the last 20 years, mainly driven by EU regulation, really systematically work towards low energy building and energy plus buildings, as they call them. And I can tell you, just as a matter of comparison, our average home would use maybe about, roughly, depends where you are, but maybe 300 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. In some of the European countries with strong building envelopes and so on, they're getting that down to about 30 per square meter. So there's a huge jump in innovation, and you continue to drive that down, both in the residential as well as the institutional and the commercial sector.
I have some experience in the residential industry, and whenever our independent studies were done, Canada always came up as being providing the best quality of housing in the world compared to any other jurisdiction in the world, that we built better housing in many ways with the building codes the way they are today. Energy efficiency is a very high priority in most, and I was involved in residential. So it's interesting to hear you say that. I need to move on because of my time, and I'd like to ask Annie if a question, and it's a fairly practical question. I have an employer in my jurisdiction that consumes right now about $10,000 a month in electricity costs, and they did the analysis a few years ago about what a carbon tax would mean to them. This is a company that employs about 600 people, fairly large-scale manufacturing in the forging industry. And they figured it out at the time, actually, of the 2011 election, that it would cost $9,000 per employee for the carbon tax that was being proposed during that election, which meant that they had a critical decision to make, and that's expand in Canada or move to Michigan or move to another. They have 2 other locations that they could have moved to. When I look at the aggressive pricing that you've put on carbon here and the other things, have you looked at the impact of companies and communities like mine that would lose 650 jobs overnight if that happened?
Well, I would point to the experience of British Columbia. As you know, they have a carbon price that is currently at $30 per ton of CO2. It's been in place since 2008. There's some really strong economic data that's been published this year in energy policy, looking at a post-hoc analysis of the employment effects of the BC carbon tax. And that has shown a very minimal effect on that province. In fact, the province has enjoyed an economic growth similar or equivalent to the rest of the Canadian provinces. But the British carbon tax, we attribute about 10% of British Columbia's greenhouse gases emission reduction can be attributed to the tax. So our recommendation to alleviate any potential impact on employment is to make sure that the tax is gradual. So we would see a national carbon pricing standard starting at 30, like British Columbia, increasing over time, making sure there's a very transparent timeline so the industry can adjust. There has been some concern by several industrial sectors about potential interprovincial competitiveness issues, and we're very aware of that. And that's why we see it's critical that the federal government show leadership and ensure there's a consistent carbon price across all provinces and territories. You'll note in our recommendation for a international carbon pricing standard, that one of the principles that we want to see implemented in all provincial and territorial carbon pricing regime is that there be funding allocated from the revenues to transition and retraining of the workers affected by the transition to the low carbon economy.
So your plan involves foreseeing that there's going to be displacement of certain industries.
Yeah,
so certain
absolutely.
industries are just going to pick up and leave because they cannot be competitive on a global basis.
I believe it there, Phil. We're over. Mr. Caron. Yeah, with 6-minute rounds this time.
Merci beaucoup et merci.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the witnesses. I would like to start with Mr. Obed and Mr. Chartier. My presence here is important. Your appearance here is important because the Métis are part of our founding peoples, and I think they have to be. We have to recognize that they are distinct, not only in terms of the issues, but also in terms of the history of First Nations. I would start with Mr. Obed. Your organization receives funding to work from the federal government.
Yes, we receive some core funding from Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Okay. Est-ce que vous avez subi des coupures ou des réductions ces dernières années dans le financement,
Have you been subject to cuts in recent years over the funding that you received from the federal government?
Yes. Since 2011, 50% of our federal funds have been cut from the organization.
Ça représente un montant de combien?
Presents how much money?
Well, we do have the core funding from the Aboriginal Representation Organization Fund, which was a much smaller cut than Health Canada and other project funding that allowed for Inuit to participate in various projects or work on various issues. But we're looking in the neighborhood of, I believe, $2 million in cuts.
Parce que votre organisation est fondamentale.
Your organization is fundamental to be able to address Inuit issues.
Yes, absolutely. We are the democratically elected representational organization for Canadian Inuit. So it fulfills constitutional requirements, the overarching duty to consult, the way in which Inuit have chosen to mobilize and to interact at the national level with the federal government, yes.
Merci. Monsieur Chartier, je vais vous poser la même question.
Chartier, I will ask you the same questions. The council is also receiving federal funding?
Yes, that's correct. But we also experienced the same diminution of funding. For example, in 2008, we had about 30 staff, and today we have about seven staff.
Et vous êtes également l'organisme qui permettait.
You're also the organization that makes it possible for the Métis to be able to speak in a single voice.
Yes, that is correct. But I should say that we have 5 what we call governing members from Ontario West, and they deliver the programs and services on the ground, such as the federal assets program and monies, the programs received from the provinces. We're at the national level a policy body that interacts on an intergovernmental basis with Canada, the provinces, and also internationally. But yes, we represent the historic Métis Nation.
Est-ce que vous pourriez dire que les coupures, les compressions dont vous avez été...
That the cuts that you have suffered in recent years have significantly impacted on your ability to do effective and work?
Well, yes, certainly it has on all levels, and in particular, for example, on international matters, we continue to be involved, but it comes from our own pocket. And nationally, we have, of course, been severely cut in our ability to marshal the forces that are required to put forward a strong position. But I believe things are better. With the previous government, we did have a process on economic development, and we were having a bit of progress there, so it wasn't all lost. We did have some progress.
Merci. C'est la même chose pour vous?
Yes.
Is that the same for you?
In our organization, we have 4 land claim regions that have their own processes. At the national level, we've created a system in which, on technical issues, we bring representatives from each of those 4 regions into the same room to then inform the way in which our positions as the national organization are structured and finalized. So we've had to suspend virtually all of those processes that would allow for Inuit from the 4 different regions to provide one voice that we would then speak to government on. And I think that there's a very huge utility in ensuring that any programs or services that government offers to Inuit are informed by Inuit from across Canada in one particular voice. Otherwise, the programs and services or the policies that are created are not done in a way that that Inuit would like, and also aren't informed by what would actually work for Inuit in Inuit Nunangat in our regions.
Merci beaucoup.
You had a minute.
Thank you. My last question for Mr. Chartier, particularly the events at La Loche were particularly tragic for all Indigenous people. I would like to know whether your organization has specific measures that it has proposed to the government to improve the situation, to ensure that young people in Aboriginal communities prosper.
So home, my granddaughter is a grade 10 student at the school. She happened to be outside the school, so that was fortunate. The community itself is a historic Métis community. Unfortunately, the press and politicians that covered it viewed it as a First Nations community. We're beginning to reverse that. Minister Bennett was up there last week, as was I, and meeting with the Métis community. And next week, I and an official from her department will be there again, and we're looking at ways and means to get the community back involved and working within the Métis Nation governance structure. Part of it is because of the weakness of the provincial body at this time, but that's being corrected as well. So there is a plan in place to begin addressing those issues, and I know the Federal Minister of Health, who was there with the Prime Minister, agreed to put aside the jurisdictional barriers and to treat the Métis in the village the same as they would First Nations people in terms of the services provided by the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. So things are beginning to take place, and it will be a long process, but we are encouraged that things will be looked at, that it won't be just a one-time visit and people will be forgotten. So, and I'll ensure that it doesn't happen in any event. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caron, Mr. Chartier. I think you can be assured that all members of the committee would pass on their regards with respect to that tragedy. Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. My first question is directed to Mr. Mueller and Ms. Berube, although the rest of you are welcome to comment on it. I think we're at a stage finally where green energy and environmental issues are understood and recognized by everybody to be important. People ask me what issues are important. I always tell them to go ask a 15-year-old because they have a better sense of things and they're not tainted by divisive political games that I think is what Mr. McClellan was referring to. So my question is this. There's recognizing the importance of the initiatives the two of you are talking about, and I assume are set out in your materials. My sense is that there's a perception with the public and in some circles that green energy costs money. So can you help me understand a way that we could explain to people that it doesn't always cost more money, it doesn't have to cost more money, and help us with some messaging? And then the second part of the question is, what happens if we don't follow through on these types of initiatives that you're talking about?
Thank you. A very good question. I think that I have to comment from a buildings perspective because, and it's also an infrastructure perspective as well, is that we need to design our overall system a lot more efficiently. Because simply replacing the energy that's based on fossil fuel now and replacing with renewable or green energy is not something that would not be an easy transition. So we need basically bring down the end use of energy that we're using. So it's it's not just on a building by building basis, but it's also the infrastructure we're providing to provide clean energy. And I think that there's enough evidence out there now. Again, depending on the region of the country and what form of energy you use, for example, a geothermal system, which is considered to be a green form of energy, has been used widely in Canada in building projects quite successfully within business cases that show that there's very favorable paybacks. The cost of solar voltaic panels or building integrated photovoltaics, those costs of those panels have come down so significantly that the business case is becoming a lot stronger. And we also have to think about that energy, these are long-term investments. Over the long term, they will certainly pay back. We have to think about infrastructure and these sort of events over the long term. And I think the business case is getting stronger and stronger as the economy of scale increase of using those types of technologies. But again, it needs to go hand in hand with efficient infrastructure and also a very efficient new and existing building stock. If we don't do it, I think that we will not be the ones that will reap the benefits from reducing our carbon output. It will be 2 or 3 generations, but I think we have a responsibility, and I would say also more responsibility, to look at all options to reduce our carbon output. And as you know, the natural world around is already changing, and we're already paying for the effects of climate change in terms of infrastructure, insurance rates, and so on. Thank you.
Ruby?
With regards to your question that green energy costs money, traditional fossil fuel energy costs money, but it's the taxpayers and the public that foot the bill. I mean, I'm an economist by training, and we talk about market externalities. We pay for our carbon emissions through the impacts of climate change on our communities, the flooding, the extreme weather events that's only going to get worse for the next generations, as well as the impact on air quality and the adverse health effects. So our current energy system is extremely expensive. It's just not the consumer that's footing the bill. It's the taxpayers and the public overall. So we need to recoup those externalities. I would echo the previous comments that currently renewable energy technologies are becoming market competitive. Solar panels have gone down in price. Canada is about to miss the boat if we don't make this transition right now. It's an economic imperative, and that's the World Bank telling us that. It's Bloomberg Finance telling us that. It's no longer Greenpeace or David Suzuki Foundation. China is the single largest investor in clean energy technology right now, and Canadian companies need to grab a share, our right share of that global clean energy market if we don't want to miss this economic opportunity.
Maloney, that'd be a very tight question.
Okay, I'll have to pick from one of many then. Again, I don't want to pick on the two of you, but you were talking about the construction industry, and you were talking about private landowners. How do you, what incentives would you suggest are appropriate to get construction companies, landowners to buy into what it is we need to do here?
Again, I think it depends on the sector of the construction industry. So, for example, developers that build market-based housing, we see a lot of construction in major cities, Toronto, Vancouver, and so on. I think they need third-party financing to pay for the costs of energy improvements in their buildings, because they build and they sell, and they have very little interest in investing something where they really don't have a payback in that sense, because the payback or the benefit goes to the tenant. So in that sector, the investment will really providing opportunity to finance the energy improvements in that building by a third party. That could be utility or could just simply be investor, because there is a business case in how these energy systems and these designs are paying back over time. On the commercial side, I think that it's not so much actually an incentive in terms of money, because the commercial sector is already quite involved and has shown some leadership in making improvements both to their new and to existing buildings. They're really showing quite a bit of leadership, mainly driven by institutional investors and pension funds in Canada. But if you go down from the Class A buildings to the Class B and C buildings, these are the ones that actually need to be incentivized. And again, financing in terms of some of the things are kind of loans to make the improvements to their buildings, or tax exemption. Because if you invest in your building, you have a better building, and at the end of the day, you pay more taxes because you have a better building. So you pay for the improvements, and then you pay for the tax. So the federal government, and as well as the province, are in a position to use some of the existing mechanisms, provide incentives to the sector to invest in energy efficiency and lower carbon buildings, and then also create a favorable business model for a building owner that's less capitalized to derive the investments, to derive the benefits from that.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller. Mr. Leipert.
Mr. McClellan, just wanted to sort of explore something with you that you touched on very briefly. There's probably no province in the country that relies on our transportation infrastructure more than Saskatchewan. And, we have heard a lot from the government about spending money on infrastructure. We've heard a lot of requests, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more before these hearings are concluded about spending money. But you touched briefly on the fact that certainly from a Saskatchewan standpoint, pipeline capacity would take away the need to use rail, thereby I'm assuming the fact that so much oil is being shipped today by rail that it has an impact on your other commodities that are important to Saskatchewan, such as potash and grain, and I suppose to a lesser degree maybe the cattle industry. Could you just outline a little bit on, without spending very much money, at least government money, how that, what has become an inequity in terms of transportation, would mean for your province?
It would mean great things. We're a province that's absolutely reliant on exports. We export more per capita than British Columbia and Alberta. We have to get our entire modal system, our transportation system, more fluid. We would not eliminate the need to put rail or oil on rail by having the pipelines, but it would reduce the impact dramatically. And I would encourage, as I've indicated, the quick approval of the Energy East, for example. The other reality that I think we need to ask this government to look at is the Canadian Transportation Act review that's underway, initiated by the previous government. Many of our organizations in Saskatchewan, including our provincial government, have put submissions in there. There is some legislative changes that need to be done that could go to enhance that system as well. I think there also needs to be some consideration given to the port communities and the access to those areas. Living next to a railway line that's increasingly busy is not much fun, I'm sure, and I think as a federal government, as they do in British Columbia as a provincial government, you need to focus on what can be done there. The reality of it is Saskatchewan had in 2013 a most successful year. We won a Grey Cup and we had a bumper crop. Subsequent to that, the only thing that people talked about in this winter of 2014 was the rider win. I don't use that as an excuse to reference it again, but I do represent the interest that we had a crisis in our agricultural sector. Our federal government and our provincial government sort of poked the rail lines. We took a more tangible action there. We hired the Conference Board of Canada to do a study to analyze what could be done. We have that available to you all, and we'd encourage you to have a look at it.
Thank you.
I'll have Lisa.
Lisa?
Very quickly, sorry I missed some of the presentation. For the Green Budget Coalition, Madame Berube, I've gone through the document and it's very well laid out, do you have the total on what the total ask is?
No, we did not do that this year on purpose, as we wanted to present options for the new government to deliver the mandate letter, so we did not tally the number of our total funding ask.
Okay, so I did, and it's $3 billion in 2016, and it's $22 billion over 5 years. So I assume you put this forward in a piecemeal, not a piecemeal, more of a pick and play kind of fashion where they can see the parts that make sense. And you're a group of 16 organizations. Do you come together in advocacy only for this piece, or do you work together on other matters as well?
Our coalition is strictly for making a submission to the federal budget. I should say, however, that we work year-long because we have a series of consultations in the fall with senior government officials where we show our preliminary recommendation, and we want to make sure that they're in line with departmental needs. So it's a year-long effort to come to these recommendations.
And I guess as the manager, you would know what the total revenue is that you get to have as a line item to pull this together. How much do you spend in putting this document together over the year then?
Oh, we spend about $100,000 a year. Yeah,
okay.
It's a very small budget.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Raitt. Before I turn to Mr. Sabero, Mr. Laycraft, in your presentation you talked about value-added processing and coming from the agriculture sector. I'm told that there is some of the international slaughterhouse companies, because they can't get labor to run slaughter lines 24 hours a day, that they're actually electing to ship cattle to facilities in the U.S. Do you know if that is happening? And if it is, what is the impact on the economy and what's the solution? I mean, we need the jobs, the stimulus, the value added in Canada. So what's the solution there?
We're about 1,000 employees short in our large plants to do the 1,000 employees short. And two companies that I'm talking about in the beef industry that process about 85%. But, you know, if you go to Prince Edward Island, I mean, they're concerned there as well with island beef and maintaining the workforce there as well. What happens is, yes, we'll send some live cattle south as a result of that, but more often than not, you'll take a product that you might further process into a consumer-ready product. Rather than doing that, we're just exporting it either as a bone-in product because it takes less labor to export it like that, or as what's called a subprimal. It's a large cut that you haven't made into consumer portion size products. And again, we'll export that rather than do the value adding here. So that happens on a regular basis. And one of the companies this past fall said, you know, they had a choice. We can either do that consumer portioning work at the plant, or we have to reduce the number of animals we're processing because we'd have to take it off this line over here because we don't have enough employees for both lines. So that's a real problem that we're seeing today.
Thank you, Mr. Before I forget, Mr. McClellan, yes, that report on the railway tie-up, etc., if you could give that to the clerk and she can distribute it to the committee. Mr. Severa.
Chair, actually for Mr. Laycroft, just to go off of what the chair said, my understanding is that the labor market shortage impacting your industry is also impacting industries in Eastern Canada, with whether it's processing of fish, picking of potatoes, some of the seasonal industries. How, if you had to put this on a scale of 1 to 10, where are we at in terms of this being a problem, and where do we see ourselves a year or two from now on this issue?
Well, I'll certainly first comment that yes, we're hearing this from every plant that we're talking to in Canada. We're hearing it from other sectors in the pork and the seafood industry that it remains a challenge, and longer term they would prefer to get to the point where we can start double shifting again, and then we can really, you get a lot of efficiencies when you do that. You know, with the current economy, it's probably dropped down to an 8 in importance, but that's still pretty important. I mean, a year ago, we probably would have had it up in the 9 level in terms of one of the major constraints. And for me to give a 9 to something, it's about as high a level as you can give it.
And if I can ask the gentleman from the Aboriginal communities or the Indigenous communities, I had the pleasure of growing up in northern British Columbia with a very large Aboriginal population. Some of my best friends and the community I grew up in. How do we get, if you can just say 2 or 3 things across Canada, Indigenous youth involved in the trades and the skills, because it's just, to me, in my humble opinion, it's a vastly untapped, fantastic resource that we need participating in our economy. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question. We are currently involved in the Assets Program, which is a training and employment program. It's very successful, at least in our communities, for the Métis. We believe that it's the right step, but it needs to be increased, expanded. And also in terms of the Métis, we don't have access to post-secondary education services from the federal government. But as I did mention, there is a promise of, in the campaign, of 25 million. No, not for that. Actually, that's ECDEV, which is also going to be helpful in this connection. But there is a promise of enhancing our scholarships and bursary programs that we currently have through the Assets Program with universities and colleges in Western Canada. That would be another step forward. But I would believe through economic development, through the bursaries program, and through the Assets Program, an enhancement of that would significantly increase our opportunities in that sector. And as well for the Métis, ensuring that industry doesn't pay lip service to the Métis when it comes to the duty to consult and accommodate, because they don't view us as rights holders, and the federal government doesn't really step forward and ensure that we are engaged to the degree that we should be. So there's a combination of these things, but it's something we look forward to working out with the new government.
If I could. If you'd like to address, the cost of solar power has declined drastically in recent years. Kind of a two-parter. Where are we on the technology side and being able to store renewable energy? And has the cost of solar power declined to a level where potentially subsidies aren't needed anymore?
Well, I would answer that question by saying that we don't have a level playing field in Canada when it comes to energy investments, right? Because the federal government continues to offer tax preferences to oil and gas and natural gas that are not available to the rest of the energy sector. So it's very unfair and challenging to compare the cost of energy in Canada, given that these tax preferences and these tax credits remain. So this is why our recommendation to phase out those tax preferences to oil and gas and natural gas industry are critical, and then you'll see a level playing field when it comes to investments in clean energy and clean technology. With regards to the cost of solar panel itself, I couldn't give you a figure right now, but we have some experts that could get back to you on that.
Thank you. Turning to Mrs. Raitt, we'll only have about 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess for the Chamber and for cattlemen, if you could give me an understanding of the importance of the strength of the United States economy to the businesses that you represent. You know, the United States, we're going to be looking at growth in this country based upon the fact that the U.S. is going to be bouncing back a little bit faster, a little bit harder, and on the consumption side, quite frankly. How important is that growth to what you're going to be seeing in your communities? And if they don't do, given the election year and we don't quite know what's going on, if their growth does sputter, what does that mean to you?
From a Saskatchewan perspective, it's absolutely critical. Not only potash, but oil and some services. In the fall of this past year, we co-hosted a Saskatchewan-U.S. Trade Summit. North Dakota has got a 2% unemployment rate. Right now, they're in the Bakken, they're heavy invested into the oil. It's absolutely critical that that economy continues. We're celebrated every single day now, and we also have some advantage with the dollar right now. We're not celebrating the dollar, but it's an advantage when we're selling into that area.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have the largest two-way trade of any two countries in the world in agri-food products between Canada and the U.S. So it's extremely important to our industry. Half of our exports, or half of our production is exported. Close to 80% of our exports go to the U.S. They're the world's largest beef market on a per value basis, so whatever occurs down there does have an impact on our prices. But at the same time, I'll go back to the other things that are starting to come into play as we start to see the growth through TPP and the reduction in tariffs in Japan. It isn't an isolated economic condition around the world. You know, as we hopefully can get the opportunity of preferential access under CETA and get those issues resolved, we see the tariffs reduced, but also the sort of hidden gems in Vietnam and other countries. South Korea has expressed an interest. Those will all diversify our ability, but it'll also strengthen the U.S. market. So we get a win-win out of that. A stronger U.S. market and stronger demand for Canadian beef is kind of the ideal situation for our industry moving forward.
Thank you very much.
We will have to cut it there. I would thank all the witnesses for coming in a very tight time frame, and I'd remind committee members that we start at 3:30 sharp at room C110, 1 Wellington Street. So, no, it's at C110, 1 Wellington. So, thank you. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.